hear what's going on.
Yep.
We're on air.
Okay, we're on.
Good evening and welcome to this working session of the
Red
Lakeville
light's
Area
on.
School Board of Education.
Are you just trying to talk?
I'm trying to talk.
Whoa. She's going to start, if you don't mind.
I'll repeat that. Good evening and welcome to this working session of the Lakeville Area Schools Board of Education. It's nice to see so many people in attendance at our meeting tonight. I will remind everyone that this meeting is audio recorded only, so make sure we keep the sound down and then you speak loudly and clearly so that the microphones can pick you up. This is for accessibility of our people that are listening online or people that listen to the recorded sessions. For attendance purposes, we'll have everyone go around and say your name and your role, just so we have that on record. Kim Baker, Chair.
Doug Van Zyl, Superintendent.
Terry Lynn, Board of Education.
Carly Anderson, Board of Education.
Steph Cass, Communications Director.
Brian Thompson, Board of Education.
Brenda Albrecht, Exec Director of Administrative Services.
Emily McDonald, Assistant Superintendent.
Sandy Georgie, Director of Elementary Teaching and Learning.
Judy Kelleher, Board of Education.
Bill Holmgren, Executive Director of Business Services.
Thank you very much. So we have two board members that are not in attendance tonight. David Anderson is out of town and Bree Shindley has other commitments, so she's not available tonight either. So just for the record, we have 5 members of the board here. So we'll go ahead and get started with our first item for discussion. These are upcoming recommendations that will be brought to the board at our next board meeting on Tuesday to vote on. So we'll start with the attendance area design update and discussion. Who's leading that discussion?
Emily and I, but it's going to take a minute for him to switch it over, I think.
Okay, perfect.
There we go. So Dr. McDonald and I will kind of walk you through this. There's some information, of course, last time that Emily and I shared with you in regard to the boundary concepts and models that were there. From that information, there were 2 more models that were developed, and they're combined elementary and middle school models. That is D3 and E3. So the elementary attendance areas for D3, you can see them there. As far as adjustments that were made, you'll be able to see between that and E3. So I'll click back and forth between the two a couple times so you can see how those adjust. So there are some fairly significant changes from one to the other when you take a look at just how the colors shift. I would say the design team, as you know, and several of you attended those meetings as well, tried to stay very focused on the guiding principles document as far as what was taking place and how to continue to monitor the adjustments that they make in that process. Then you go from the elementary school models, and then there's an overlay of the middle school models. The blue lines show the elementary. Of course, you've got the 3 middle schools that are displayed there and how those elementaries, and just to show you kind of, again, from the elementary to the middle school, the overlay of those blue lines and how the elementary schools would move forward from there. And Emily, Dr. McDonald, anytime you want to chime in, if I miss something, go ahead and shout over me. So then you had D3, this is the E3 with the overlay as well. So again, from D3, you can see the adjustments. Many of them are in alignment with what happens with the elementary school boundary adjustments as well, because there's a lot of folks that want to make sure that if there's an adjustment that the kids transitioned from one elementary to a middle school, or if it was split, there was only 2 middle schools, that they were split between. So again, oops, went a little too far. D3, middle schools, E3, middle schools. So the current boundary path is on the left. D3 draft school path is in the middle. E3 draft school path is on the right. So you can see how they've adjusted. There are a couple of adjustments that you can see that we have fewer splits in some of our schools to do that, and that was one of the things that our input from the community shared with us as well. I'll let you look at that for just a second because I know it's a lot to absorb.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
Is it possible for us to get the numbers on percentages of school that are going to?
The percentage of kids out of each school, I think that's on the map, so we should be able to pull that for you. Yes, ma'am. So from there, we were able to put together the input round for round 3. Again, the guiding document that was principles that was put together, and what we tried to do there was take a look at each of the items that were there, and if there's a green check next to it, it was able to be mostly accomplished in that particular area. We would just up front and say there is no perfect model because we know that it's impacting families and kids through that process, but trying to do what the guiding principles document said. The input and the design team went through this and tried to say, do we meet the criteria that are there? And you can see for both models, all of them seem to be checked, except for, of course, that third one, which is to be determined based on what boundary area you select as a board member group to determine how that would play out. So the design team input, what they tried to do is take each model and from each model list the strengths and challenges. And again, I'll leave that up there for a minute for you to be able to absorb. I'm not going to read it all to you, but you can see for the strengths as far as the D3 model, I'll just highlight a few things that are there. The overcrowding capacity concerns are addressed at Cherry View, Eastview, Oak Hills, and Century. There are lower capacity buildings that could be utilized for special programming. Demographics, you can see the areas as far as demographics, how those are played out, and in all situations they seem to be at an acceptable level. That does not mean that there's not a difference. There is no way to balance them out perfectly to say there's 20% here, 20% here, and 20%. Just based off where people live and how we were able to draw the boundaries, you can't get it exactly the same, but they try to be within acceptable areas. Title I funding, as somebody pointed out, could be a little more consistent, helps having similar offerings across our school systems. Bus routes, that was something that our bus company took a look at. They feel like they're able to decrease the overall routing in both the models, actually, I believe, because of the contiguous boundaries instead of jumping over multiple boundaries.
Can I ask a question?
Sure can.
So for the challenges, it says that Lakeview Elementary is anticipated to face capacity challenges in the next 2 to 3 years.
Mm-hmm.
Is that for both D3 and the E3 model? Because my question would be, if that's the case,
Mm-hmm.
Is that going to last long enough before we have to do another boundary redraw or something to accommodate that?
And here's E3, so it kind of jumped to that over there on the right. Lakeview is anticipated to be at capacity within 2 to 3 years on either one of the models. Now, again, this is anticipated growth,
Okay.
and so it's not guaranteed, but that is one of the things that we pointed out on both those models that could be an issue. As far as just finishing out the strengths, again, I won't read it all to you. Only 3 elementary schools split into 2 different middle schools. Currently, there's 4 schools split, with 1 splitting into 3. Challenges, jump over, you touched base on one of those. Also, the demographic balance. Highview has a low educational benefit, free and reduced lunch program. The demographics compared in that building to others are a little bit more skewed in that particular model. E3, again, I won't read everything to you. I'll let you kind of look through it. Again, it does alleviate some of the concerns at Cherry View, Oak Hills, and Century. School utilization maximized for Christine Huddleston and Orchard Lake, which are not expected to experience significant growth. Now, one of the things that we have to mention here as well, there's 2 types of growth. There is neighborhood turnover, meaning that as people in the neighborhood get a little bit older, maybe they could sell their houses and younger families could purchase. That comment really is based more off of construction growth than it is turnover growth, but you have to try to take both of those into account. So there is a possibility that some of our older neighborhoods could turn over. It really just depends on what happens in the community as far as how some folks may choose to do that or not. Demographic balance, you can see there highlighted as, again, a strength. Bus routes, again, like neighborhood schools, only 2 elementary schools are split into 2 different middle schools. Currently, again, 4 are split with 1 splitting into 3. Challenges, as you mentioned, Lakeview is the school in both of these that has some possible issues in 2 to 3 years. And the middle schools are anticipated to be overcrowded within the next 5. Now, you have to remember, that's because of our projected growth. We do try to project 2% growth over every year moving forward. So that could either increase or decrease depending on what happens in the economy, how quickly people feel like moving or not moving or selling. So those are approximates, those are not guarantees when you say 2 years or 3 years in that process. And I've said this before, and I just try to be as upfront as I can be about it. At some point, we're going to have to touch boundaries again. If you go from 12,000 students to 15 or 16,000 students, there's no real way not to touch boundaries again. And as you've heard me say before, it would have been nice if maybe we had touched boundaries a few years prior to now, because there's a lot of significant boundary adjustments that are taking place rather than maybe a little here, a little there in the process. So that's something we've tried to take into account. The demographic balance is a little bit more or less balanced in this particular model in E3 than D3, and that's one of the things we wanted to point out as well. Anybody need me to click back to the other strengths and list? Are we okay with that? Okay, Emily, anything you want to touch base on that I didn't highlight? Okay. So then what we did is we got our feedback. This is where the input team provided their feedback to us and what they voted on. You can see that the design model D3 is in green, design model E3 is in blue, and then no preference. They could say that either one they were fine with. So the input team and their responses, you can see, I believe that says 50%, 35%, and 15%. And that was from the input team that put that feedback together.
Can you clarify how many people were on the input team?
On the input team, there's 26 who responded to that vote. That was the group that, you had the design team, the input team, there was about 40 on the input team, so 26 of them voted on this and gave a response. So some of the comments that were there from the input team, because the input team was able to have like a little comment box that they were able to write down there. On D3, they felt like there's clear boundaries, there's a lesser number of impacted students, better demographic balances for the middle schools. Some themes on E3, better pathways for elementary to middle school and high school, better balance in educational benefit outcomes, still has demographic disparities, and it keeps the western neighborhoods together. So that was feedback from that input team that sent that to us. On round 3, some additional other comments. Some of the things that were mentioned is the talking about grandfathering, do not allow transfers without clear guidelines, comment on how models might impact academic performance, and they did say that the models tried to embrace the community feedback that was given. Any question on any of that so far?
One thing I think,
Yep.
just because people have asked me, and one thing I think is important to clarify is why we were taking feedback from the community on this other than the vote.
Sure. I'll start out and then others can chime in along the way. Because as we went through the process, more and more of the comments became individualized rather than thematic or things that could be clustered together, which I get. As a parent, you're going to talk about how it impacts your child, how it impacts maybe your individual neighborhood. And so that was out of the 3,000-ish comments, I think, on the second go-around, a majority of them were very individualized, and it was harder to pull themes out to be able to address. And so we had gotten to the point as a design team, and again, anybody can chime in, staff or Emily, because I know that they were part of it as well, is that the design team kept looking at models and it started going back, well, if we adjust this, we already had that. If we adjust this, we already had that. So it got to the point where they were starting to backtrack on things that they were doing, and I know you were a part of that meeting and heard some of that comments as well. And so the more you kept looking at models, they got to the point that they felt like E2, D2, those two models were closer. The comments were less, like I said, specific about the models themselves and more about individual impact. So they felt like by making the adjustments to D3, E3, that the comments again would be more individualized and much harder to make any adjustments on the model. So Emily or Steph,
I think
anything?
the only thing that I would add is, we had some pretty deep discussion at the design team meeting, and there really was a sense that given all of the feedback, given the guiding change, given what we're trying to do, that we did come to consensus in the group that these were the two models that we were going to put forward, because as Dr. Van Zyl said, we did end up, like, we would undo what we did, and then it would throw everything off in this direction, and then we'd redo it this way, and then it would throw everything off in this direction. And we felt like after all of the trying to be responsive to all of the previous comments, going through quite a number of iterations of things, that this is what we wanted to bring forward as the two final options. So we did want to give people at least an opportunity to sort of weigh in on whether or not they have a preference, recognizing, and I think I said this last time, that this is significant, and it's significant for families, and so we understand that as well.
how many people replied like they don't like any of the options?
You have on,
Is it no preference?
We have a no.
it's a no preference.
We had a
so-
no preference, yeah.
Well, but that's
But
not
that was
like,
just the input.
but that's that doesn't mean it's like they don't like it. They don't have an so what I'm hearing is that there wasn't an option for them to select. I don't like either of these options.
No, correct, that's not on
How
the,
many people replied?
this is just the input team
Oh,
that
the
responded
input
here.
team,
You're
okay.
getting to the community feedback here in a second.
Got it.
I think we had 1,600.
Okay.
So here, public input. So the public feedback, there were almost 1,700 unique responses to that. You can see D3 is in blue, E3 is in orange, no preferences in gray. So again, you can see the numbers that are there. It's fairly similar as far as what the input team preferences were in regard to percentages. So again, you can see there wasn't it was either no preference or select one of these. So, current status and next steps. Based off the information, there's a school board work session this evening. You have the opportunity to discuss the concepts of D3 and E3. You can review the feedback from the design team and public input. We've kind of walked through that. And then the timeline would be able to try to bring this to the school board for recommended action on the 27th. That timeline would keep us on track to be able to begin our staffing process, which if you visit with our staff is a fairly significant issue for us and for them, because the longer we are delayed, it has some bigger impacts for us, similar to when we went through the budget reductions last year, and there's already enough turmoil and stress going on that to delay it longer would, in my opinion, be detrimental to them and to us as the district. So with that, I think that is the last one. Emily, anything else to
I
add?
just had a comment about the timeline.
Yep.
So I know Terry and I, a month ago, 3 weeks ago, we sat in on a meet and confer, and that was one of the topics that they brought up, was to make sure that we stay on track with the timeline out of respect for the staff, because what happened during the budget process was very hard, and they did not want to see that happen again. So it was really important for us to stay on track to this.
Yeah, and it's going to affect every elementary building will be affected.
Yeah.
And the secondary, the middle schools will be somewhat affected. So there's questions there. But that's major.
Well, and it also comes not just on the staffing, but the operations with busing and routes.
Oh, right.
And all of that goes into play.
You've got to move textbooks, you've got to move, you got a major problem.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that leads us to the comment discussion part that you may have. So we will open it up to you as board members. If you have any discussion, questions, comments, we'll do our best to answer those for you.
So there's
Can I
been
turn it to you?
a lot of questions and concerns about the Golden Pond neighborhood and how that fits into either of these models. I think in both of the models, that neighborhood has moved to a different school. Can you kind of show on the map like where that's at and give us some background on like how that was discussed, or was that a part of the discussion for these models? Or was there feedback on that? It just seems like we're getting a lot of feedback on that particular neighborhood, and I need to visualize where it's at and where, and the concept of where that falls with these two models.
Which one would be the easiest to show it on?
Should be the elementary one.
Upper left-hand corner.
I think you've got, I can't tell you if it's easier on this one or this one. I think E3 it stays in, and D3 it comes out. So I think it's the upper quadrant of that.
So like
Area.
that little piece that goes.
Emily,
It's the northeast corner of 210th and Dodd.
Yeah, I just can't see it.
Just to the left of where the JFK flag is.
it's this little area right in here, I believe.
Yes.
Okay, so is that impacted in both models?
Oh, no,
then?
it's
Yes.
this side. This side?
No.
No.
That's the one that changes.
Where you were.
You were right, Doug.
Oh,
You were
That
right.
little corner.
this area right here.
Yeah.
Correct.
That's what they're saying.
So, and I think the discussion, at least that I remember, and again, anybody can chime in from our group that was a part of it, is that there's a lot of neighborhoods that are impacted by this particular area. And I don't know that we necessarily said Golden Pond, or I think Chadwick was another one. I know there were some, Donnelly Farms was mentioned, there was a territory that was mentioned early on. So it really came through a lot of the comments that people were sharing. And as we were as the design team was trying to walk through this adjustments, they felt like that was the cleanest way to draw some lines. Not that, again, that it doesn't impact kids, but you're impacting kids in other neighborhoods as well. So it was hard for them to single out, I think, one neighborhood over another. Even though some people may not feel like that's the case, I do believe that the design team really tried to take a look at how they were able to draw the lines, try to consistent with the guiding principles that were there.
Yeah, I think I would just add that when we had our first 2 rounds of feedback, we did go through all of those comments, and there were, as you saw last time I presented, that there were a number, different neighborhoods had different concerns with different models, which is why we wanted to get their feedback. A couple of things, we definitely prioritized the contiguous boundaries. That was really going in something that we were really looking to accomplish. In addition to that, we really tried to, if we were going to make a move, keep neighborhoods together. So in some cases you saw from model to model, there were neighborhoods that were literally like split in half, and that was readjusted to try to make that better. In this particular case, the challenge is really around where you draw the line from the capacity of Lakeville. So that was part of the discussion, which is why that particular neighborhood remained in.
Should someone call the police or someone?
She's got it.
Somebody? Can we recess for a meeting, please?
You want to take a break?
Yep.
Take a motion to recess or hold it.
Recess and meeting, please. Can you take a break? I did.
We're going to take a quick break.
Thank you for your patience. We are officially back at the table from our recess, and we'll continue our discussion on the boundaries. I think our last point that we left off on was the Golden Pond neighborhood. We were talking about that and how that fits in here. I'm not quite sure exactly who was speaking last, but
And then we got to the comments and questions. But again, thank you all for
thank you for your patience.
doing that.
Appreciate it.
And now it is last slide.
Okay.
Comments or discussion?
Yeah, if you want to go back to E3 for me, or D3, one of those three.
I'm sorry, Brian, what?
Oh, can you go back to slide, whatever the E3 model is, or D3?
E3?
Yeah, we can go to E3, either is fine.
Okay.
Yeah, so I've got my initial thoughts, so glad to know that these are going to be the two proposed model. I will then do additional research and just make sure that I understand these other two that you're going to recommend next week. I've got a couple concerns around proximity and so forth. So when I look at both D3 and E3, especially the Orchard Lake location, so how my mind kind of thinks is like it makes more sense to ensure that we've got our landlocked locations at capacity, knowing that the turnover may not be as high. And so that's just kind of my point of view. And so when I look at Orchard Lake as an area, there isn't a pathway for those that are above 185th by the brackets area to get to Orchard Lake. They have to jump on the highway or jump on a different road, a judicial to, I'm sorry, not judicial, to get to another road. And so if I look at the bottom right of the green section, like Lakeview Elementary is literally less than a mile away from where they live. And so I'm having a tough time understanding this boundary design, because proximity is one of our bigger factors in making sure that folks get to the right location. And so when I look at Orchard Lake, assuming there's a dotted line, let's say right below Orchard Lake itself, because again, all those homes underneath it, there isn't a pathway for them to move up. Do they go to Eastview? Do they not? And then you've got the bottom right location going all the way up to Orchard Lake, when they can, again, jump on that main road by the movie theater and go straight to Lakeview. And so I understand that that capacity issue is an issue. I don't know how many kids are in this purple Lakeview zone bucket. But that's kind of where my head's at, that we want to focus on landlocked locations where there isn't going to be more development. We already know how many kids are generally going to be there. There might be a plus or minus 10% over the next 3 to 5 years, but that means that that location isn't going to be, or generally high probability won't be impacted when we may do redesigns 2-3 years later down the road. Now, we shouldn't be doing boundary changes every 2-3 years where we can avoid that. And so that's kind of where my head's at when I look at D3 and E3. I don't see that concept in mind. So proximity would be my primary factor. Looking at capacity, making sure that we've got feeder schools into the right middle schools without breaking them up, but also understanding the long-term vision of where we're going to go. And so I've got a lot of thoughts in my head, but those are my initial thoughts on D3 and E3.
So just
go ahead,
to comment on the capacity thing, because that was mentioned on one of the slides, that they wanted to have some of those schools not at full capacity so that we had room for special education programming. Is that correct?
Correct.
So we have to have some, I mean, we can't put all of them at capacity, which is, we're not going to be
Right.
eventually.
So what's
but yeah,
capacity? What number is capacity?
85%, right?
What they normally recommend is 80 to 85% is when you feel like you're full.
Okay.
And you still a little bit of room to move around, but as soon as you start hitting that 85, 90%, then you're starting to feel pretty tight.
Do we have a grid that shows each elementary school and what their capacity levels are based on the model?
It's on the,
I haven't looked at yet. So
it's not on this particular slide, but it's on each
It's
one
in
of the
packet?
maps.
Okay.
I believe that was sent out on each one of the options that are there. As far as location, you've heard me say this before, where our schools are located are not ideal.
100%.
It would be much more ideal if we were able to pick up a school and move it
Yep.
to the right location, and we can't. And so that, to kind of your proximity, that's the issue. But transportation has looked at this. They were part of the design team, and they're like, you don't have to jump on 35 to get up there. They know ways to get there because they prefer not to get on 35 because it could slow you down 15, 20 minutes depending on the time of the day. So they know how they can get through there with their busing.
Yeah, and I get that, but you've got landlocked locations more than likely at Oak Hills, which all those locations won't have further development. More than likely, Christina Huddleston is landlocked, and then we got all that open space south of Judicial or south of 185th that are currently zoned to go to Orchard Lake. So I'm having a tough time with both the D3 and E3 models, but that's just my point of view.
Yeah, and I think that there was some discussion about that, and Emily can chime in as well. Because I think on other models, we had different lines drawn in certain areas. We're like, hey, we want our neighborhood to stay together.
Yep.
And I think
breaking that up right now.
as far as you go further to the west, it's larger acreage lots for the
Yes.
most part. It's not as many neighborhood, I don't want to say neighborhoods, it's just smaller tracts of housing in the city as compared to out there. So that normally generates fewer kids, and that was something that was discussed as well.
We were asked to compare D3 with E3, right?
Correct.
We're looking at that. In my mind, I think D3 is a better proposal, and yeah, I'm only saying that because 59% of the people out of the 1,600 selected it. 10% said they didn't care, so now you're up to 69% of the.
Well, how many people don't like either of them? You
Well-
don't have that answer, and I don't have that answer.
Well, that's, I mean, we're not in a place to
We're not.
decide who doesn't like it. We need to be able to move forward with a proposal, and the board agreed to this process.
Yep.
And we received lots of community input along the way in this process, and so we're at a point of needing to make a decision so we can open the school.
Yeah, between D3 and E3. And another thing, I like the idea that demographics is better balanced under D3. What I really like is I asked the question, how many fewer kids are going to be moved? In D3, 100 less kids are moving, which I think is a major plus for that. And,
Well, 100
Yeah.
elementary and 90 middle
Uh,
schools, so.
pardon?
100
Fewer middle school
elementary
also.
and 90 middle school, so it's 190 less kids. meaning
Okay,
that-
190, I didn't count the middle. I just
Yeah.
went with the elementary. So you had 190 less kids being moved. That's pretty positive. The other thing that I noticed was that, I'm not sure it said on D3 or E3, but on D3 it said the transportation routes would be shorter, which I think is good for kids too.
It
So I'm trying
says,
to
it says
think-
it on both because you're getting rid of the overlapping boundary. You're not
Okay.
jumping across boundaries is why
So
they said
which
that.
one do you think would be even better?
I'm not the transportation
Ah.
person, but based
put
off
you
of
on the spot. I don't
based
mean
off
to
of
do
having
that.
two of them there, they said it's better to have either one, D
Okay.
or E, than what they
So that's
currently
a
have.
plus for both then?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's where I'm coming from right now, if I was to choose between the two.
Sorry, was there something?
Have we consistently had an issue with Lakeview being at capacity in
No.
2 to 3 years?
Oh, excuse me. No, it's
No,
been
I
going
mean,
down.
Across the models. Like, I know this is an issue with both of these models. I guess that's what I'm concerned about, is what we're gonna do about Lakeview in 2 to 3 years.
I think it was, if it wasn't Lakeview, I think it was another school within the models, just because of where they're located and and the way some of the neighborhoods have quite a few kids in certain little areas. I think if I remember correctly, I'd have to go back and double check them, so don't hold me 100% to it. But I think we had some capacity issues in regard to some other schools as well. Some models were like, why are you having Highview open at 50%? You know, there were some that were higher. And to Brian's point, we did have the conversation about trying to figure out how to deal with some of our landlocked neighborhoods and be able to say, how do you do that? And again, just the way the location is, you know, even where Christina Huddleston is on that map, right across the street is going to Eastview.
Yeah.
And so that's just the nature of where our schools are located. I can't say it's right, or I can tell you it seemed a little wacky to me. But again, we built where there was some growth at that particular time and probably got good prices for property. And I think to the point that Brian was making earlier, we have to be able to try to take a look at forward thinking as far as if and when we do something else with middle schools and elementary schools, where does it make more sense? I'd tell you, it doesn't make sense to put a school on Ipava. If we're looking to do that, I think we have to take a look at where that projected growth is, and that's why there is probably some boundary adjustments again in the not too distant future, depending on how quickly we grow. That's not what everybody likes to hear, but a lot of your growing districts basically phase that every 3 to 5 years. They know they're going to readjust the boundaries, so they get to that point where, all right, they have enough schools, they feel like they've got the capacity levels within their schools balanced out, and then it turns around and older neighborhoods start revitalizing, and so then it's kind of a reoccurring process.
To that point, though, we also had some of the principals were on the design committee
Yep.
too, and they have the nuances of what's going on in their school neighborhoods and communities as well.
Yeah, I'm solely thinking about if by chance we have to do a middle school in the next 3 to 5 years, let's say.
The next 2.
We have to do something.
We'll have to do something.
Yep.
And so let's say Lakeview's at capacity too, or above capacity. I mean, that's where it's like, is there anything we can do to push that even a couple of years so that we?
What's JFK's capacity
Well,
right now with this model?
It's below Lakeview. I want to say it's around 80%.
Right.
I mean, the facilities task force, I think that we just got, said that a middle school is something that we want to do next in our projections, with a request to maybe, is it next year or within the next 1 to 2 years? And then you've got to build it out. So let's say in the next 3 years, a middle school will be online, ballpark, with obviously the commitment from the community. And like you said, we're not going to put a middle school right next to Century or Kenwood. And so the growth area is going to be further south, more than likely. And so I'm just spitballing here. You get a middle school further south, and if you have a middle school further south, it might make more sense to make that into a hybrid school, an elementary and a middle school, where it allows us to capitalize on the Elko, New Market population so that they don't have to drive so far, and then that would ease some of the tension and the capacity constraints that Lakeview or JFK might have in 2 to 3 years. And so when you think of that kind of long-term vision, how much of those JFK kids that's further towards the tip on the top right, whatever that main road is, I think that's by Lakeville South High School. Because right below that, I believe, is all industrial park. Do you spin that across? And, obviously there's some folks underneath Lakeview, and that I think maybe it is that pond section. Maybe they go to JFK, and that frees up some of the capacity at Lakeview Elementary so that it's not at 85% or on 90% right now. You increase or you go further up so that Lakeview kids are including, obviously the 185th location and further south. And then you've got those that are right below Orchard Lake, have them go eastwards into Eastview. And so, but again, that's kind of where my head's at, because you want to protect our outside boundaries. You want room for growth further south, maximize your capacity and landlocked locations, knowing that there may be 5 to 10% variance. Because we've got plenty of schools and capacity on the right-hand side. That should be our foundation, because of the longer commutes and the proximity wise, it's going to be on the further south, and how do we keep those kind of homes closer together. But I'm not based on this initial design, but that's my point of view. So I'll have to do some more research this week and see.
Well,
But
the challenge we're facing, we have to make a decision next week, right?
we don't have to make a decision.
Well,
We don't.
Yes,
We
we
don't
do.
have an option to not.
But we also have 11,800 kids that are being impacted, and I'm not going to have them change boundaries again just because we put a design that doesn't make sense for 2-3 years. I mean, the landlocked locations, will they need to be redesigned again?
So let's just reset here. This was a process that we knew was going to need to take place
Yep.
when Highview was opened. This board took time to learn and understand what this process is. I've been through a lot of boundary change processes. No process has ever been as inclusive as this one for getting our community input, and I think it's really critical. The process was really important to hear. The input team was incredible, 40-some people on that, and looking at the district and how it's best serving the district. And we had 2 of those, lots of feedback over, 3,500 pieces of input that the design team, I sat in on one of the design team meetings, I know a couple of you did, and they took all of that into consideration. And we know some were even input that countered each other. But looking at what is best for the school district at this time, knowing we're continuing to grow and we are doing our best to do a long-term solution here, but we know it can't be because of our growth and because of doing a middle school in the near future. And if the projections are right, either at that time or not far behind another elementary. And so we do have to create some solutions. And I know we heard from some of the families, we're hearing everybody's input. And I shared this with a couple of ladies I talked to tonight. Even though we may not be doing what you're asking or wanting, we're hearing it all. We've listened to it all. We're taking it very seriously. And the next step to this is to help transition their families, the ones that are changing, as much as possible in creating that sense of community in those new schools. And that we need time to do that, so the decision needs to be made for operations, for the families who are transitioning, they need that time, our teachers need that time, and our staffing needs that time. So we do need to make a decision. And I can't say that any one is better than the other, because we are impacting people, and we have to know that the next steps needs a lot of time so we can do the transitions right for all the families that are transitioning. So I just, and for our staff, I think we have to make a decision. We're not gonna find anything that's perfect. And this is a process that we agreed to, and the input into this process has been incredible. And I can't thank the community members enough for all they did to be a part of this and learn and understand it.
Yeah, I completely understand and respect your point of view. And as a board member and as yourself, you have the right to make any decisions that you need to. I would be curious, how are you determining which model is better than another? What are your success metrics, or what metrics do you know that decide, hey, I think D3 is better than E3?
I think it goes back to the list that we had with the parameters, the slide that had our guiding principles on it, and making sure that they meet our guiding principles, and then looking at the pros and the cons. And if all things equal, if transportation is, equally successful in both, and then I think it really comes down to which one is minimizing the least amount of impact to our kids. They all seem to be meeting the guiding principles, right?
Mm-hmm.
The do's, the don'ts, and accomplishing what we need to accomplish. So then I'm kind of like with Terry, is then let's look at the one that minimizes the least impact to the kids. Because I'm not sure, is the goal on Monday, are we having both of these brought before us, or is it tonight? The goal tonight is decide which one is going to be on as a recommended action for us to vote on. Is that correct?
We're presenting administratively both of them to you.
To both of us.
Yeah.
Are you doing that on Tuesday night
Yes.
too? Oh, okay. Okay, so.
Because the design team felt, and again, Emily can chime in, the design team felt based off of the things that were marked off, that either one of these
Either
would
one
work.
would work.
But we would agree from the design team model, D3 impacts fewer kids, so
Yep.
majority of the design team lean that way.
Yeah.
But they're saying, that's why they felt like giving the community the opportunity to decide as well, and see where they leaned on that, because either one of them, we felt like would be a step in the right direction to getting us where we need to be.
So my question would be, it was on one of the slides where we talked about how are you grandfathering in people, or what is the open enrollment for that? Because we could choose a model, but then it's going to sway the numbers either way if we let people be grandfathered in, or the open enrollment numbers. So what's the plan for that?
There's a team that's been working on that, and that's not really the board decides this. The implementation of carrying it out is done administratively, so there's been a team of folks that have been working on that process as far as grandfathering open enrollment, people that are inter-district transferred already, multiple things that people have asked those questions about. That'll all be presented to you at the implementation phase of things.
So not on Tuesday.
Nope.
So one question that has come up that I just want to give space to answer to is why impact middle schools right now?
Well, we started out not trying to impact middle schools, but when you start adjusting elementary boundaries, it started
And where they go?
in where they go and how you divide elementary schools up, but that's why it impacted the middle schools as well. And we also have, there are some inequities with numbers currently, and so to try to balance those out a little bit better.
I think that's come up. That came up in our stakeholder session today, and I think that's come up. I have questions on this.
Well, and in all honesty, we looked at elementary, middle school, and high school. And then when we started going through the process, we're like, ooh, don't think you want to touch high school. And so by going through this process, that was one of the things that I think the design team tried to take into account as well, as how do you not impact high school, keep your boundaries as consistent as they can be, elementary to middle school, have fewer divisions at the elementary level, and then process it through.
I think one thing I still, and I think you said it somewhere, is I just want to see percentages of schools that go, so like
The number of splits, the percentage of kids.
Yep.
Yeah, and I think it's on the maps, but we can try to pull that out separately for you.
Because if kids are making a split at elementary and then they're going to Kenwood, for instance, and they're splitting again then that's just like double.
Yeah.
So it depends, because right now you can see we have one school that goes to all three middle schools
Yeah, Lakeville.
currently. And kind of know Terry had asked that question, like, I don't think that, and I'm like, well, yeah, there's a little pocket right here that based off capacity, people got sent. So really, that's one of the things that we heard from the community, I think even on the first round of modeling and concepts, was try to have paths that make sense and are similar to what they are now, knowing that there's going to be a little bit of change in that process, particularly at the middle school level. I think most people realize with the new elementary coming online, almost all the elementaries are going to be impacted. The middle school conversation segued from this conversation right here.
Any further questions?
I just want to say I think to somewhat respond to Brian's question earlier, the design team has been full of lots of really good information in terms of questions that I've had, and it's really hard knowing, how this will impact kids, but I think just seeing what the community response has been, it's hard, but there is there's clear data to follow.
So can I ask how is this being presented to us to vote on then if you're bringing both to us? Are we voting?
Someone would probably have to make a motion to accept one model over the other.
Basically, what I would say that we're going to do is we're going to have both models in front of you, but say from the design team, we are leaning towards D3.
You're making a semi-recommendation.
But a semi-recommendation, but either two of these models from the design team's perspective would get us there. And I think point out the things that we did, that there are fewer kids impacted by D3 than E3. At least that's kind of what I remember the conversation being, Steph or Emily, and Sandy, you were part of that conversation too, so. And I think to Carly's point, you have very similar results. The input team results and the community results are fairly close for the number of.
The team did not know the community feedback at the time that they.
No.
So then at the same
Nope.
time.
Yeah, you're the first people that have seen this feedback. The input team hasn't seen any. They voted their own conscience and ideas.
So then, when we do make the decision and the vote on Tuesday, what's the next steps and how soon do we move into discussions with principals and families to make them feel somewhat comfortable with the transition?
Right away.
It's gonna take
The
place?
elementary folks have already been working on plans to how do they do that. As soon as we have an idea, we already have the numbers on what staff may be impacted by each one of these, so we'll be able to work with the EML in that process as well, I believe. We've been trying to work on an MOU, MOA on what that process would look like, so we'd start that and it would start moving fairly quickly. And again, I think most of the staff would tell you that would be something that they would prefer. I think we all would prefer, because it gives people an understanding of where they're going to be, what positions may or may not be open in that process as well.
So back in October, you know, I asked, what's our remediation plan if it does not get approved? Because part of the process was that designs would be made, input team would provide feedback, community feedback. It would come to the board, and the board has the option to approve or not approve, and it would go back to the circle. And so that there would be an iteration that might need to occur. So what I'm hearing right now is that there isn't going to be an iteration, and it needs to be a decision made by Tuesday, versus what was shared, because I've asked specifically back then, if we don't align to these models, how are we going to adjust? So is there an official deadline where this has to be done, or do we even have working sessions? I mean, maybe those are things we have to think about, but.
Well, I think the response at the time was given to you. If you don't make the decision, it goes back through the process again and it stretches everything out. You're probably not opening Highview Elementary, and you'll have staff members trying to figure out what in the world's going on. So if you as a board don't decide on what you're going to do, which you could choose not to do, the process goes back through and everything. In my opinion, there's no moving forward until it goes through a whole nother thing, because there's no way that we're going to have time administratively to implement anything going through a whole nother iteration. And my question would be, what do you think you're going to get different? Because you're still going to have, to your question, is when do people like these or not like these? Well, I would venture to guess 90 to 95% of the people would say, I don't like this because it impacts me. And that's not what you as a board are elected to do, is to talk about an individual.
We as a board need to be thinking long-term and strategically around the capacity levels, landlocked levels, proximity levels, not needing to re-boundary things again 3, 4, 5 years down the road. Those are the things that I'm thinking about. It's less about, go ahead.
But to your point, like, we are a growing district.
Yeah, but
Right,
where's the
so
growth
within,
coming? But where's the
within
growth
3
coming from?
years, we're gonna have to build another school, either a middle school or an elementary school, and we're gonna have to redraw the boundaries again anyway.
But do you know where that growth is coming from?
You
Well,
have,
I mean-
you have projections demographically where that growth is coming from and where it's going to be.
But where are those projections right now? I mean, because the grid that I see shows some arrows, or I think there was some graphs around, this school might have this many kids, or this school might have that many kids. I mean, is the growth more on the west side, or is it coming from the east side? Because we'll have the capacity on the east side, is what I think.
It really is going to depend on multiple things that are outside of your control or my control. It's like, what's construction costs? Are they putting up townhomes? Are they putting up single-family homes? Are they going to put up apartments? And I work with Justin and Tom out of Elko New Market and the city of Lakeville, the city administrators, to get that information. So Teamworks tried to pull all of that information from what they have from the city to be able to plan that forward. But again, some of those things are not within our periphery of being able to control. So I wish I could tell you that I had a crystal ball to say this is exactly where the school would be. And I wish I could tell you that 4 or 5 years ago there was an exact plan to address some of these things. But I think the district tried at the time to do what they could not to upset moving people around. And that's why you have the quilt work patch of boundaries that we have right now, which would have been nice to maybe address a couple of those things 3, 4, 5 years ago. Say, hey, here's an adjustment as we grow. Here's the adjustment. And our school locations are part of the issue for us as well. Just, I think we all realize that. You got to call reality and say, we're trying to play the best hand that we're dealt, and it's not going to be perfect in that process, because I'm not going to, in all honesty, I'm not going to be able to answer some of those questions for you until we get 2, 3 years down the road, see what the economy does, see what the price of lumber does, all those types, price of land.
And I think
Did you have something? Sorry.
I was just gonna note that, I mean, I already said something about the design team and their expertise in this process, the input team having their, spec process, and I feel like what, just came up was Teamworks, having all the data. So I feel like it's what we wanted received, and you can't go through this without people being upset, and that's what's really hard. But for me, that's what I wanted this whole time, is I am concerned about Lakeview, that is the one thing that remains a concern for me, but, did you trust that there's principal input on that, and we can plan around that if it does get to the point of capacity, and we have to, at this point, respect our, I feel like the staff and educators and make decisions, so be prepared for our opening there.
And I think it's also a challenge to, we can do as much long-term planning as we want, but it hinges on, what do we have? We have 4 cities and 2 townships that we represent, so we have to work with all those plans. And there can be a day like Elko New Market at one point had major lots, and all of a sudden they changed the size of their lots. So knowing that their growth could be that much more, and if we planned for bigger lots, because we didn't know they were gonna do that, or the year that Lakeville put a moratorium on building when we just opened a new school and we were expecting growth. And so I think we can only long-term plan as long as our cities can long-term plan, but they make one change to it and it impacts us. And so, we have to do the best that we can, and I think the process has been great, and I think the solution we've come up with is the best that we can do in this scenario. And again, we're not going to please everyone, but I hope that everybody embraces what they can, knowing that we're going to do the best for the child and make sure that they have a sense of community to wherever they're moving into. And I know our principals are committed to doing that.
So what I'm hearing from the board is that we have these 2 models. Carly has asked for the percentages to be put on those so we can kind of see the percentage of students that are being moved. You said that's something that you can provide and do for the board.
Not being impacted, I just want to see the split,
Like if
percentage of
this
the
elementary is divided, how many kids are going to this
Right,
middle
what
school and this middle
percent?
school?
Okay. Sorry about that.
This middle school versus that. And
Okay.
what percentage of Kenwood, for instance, goes to North
Yeah,
versus
And,
South?
and I would say we have to be a little careful of that, because even like Dr. Labatt was on the team, he's like, well, right now my split is probably 20-80.
Yeah.
And so he goes, if it stays 20-80, it's probably gonna be fine. If it goes 30-70, it's hard to say exactly what that is going to be, because I think you also have to know the numbers a little, if we can get them, for exactly what that split is today. I didn't know those numbers till he started sharing them with me, so that's what our current ones are. So we can try to track that down, because
Okay.
be able to give you
Right.
that.
So then that gives us a week to look through the information. We have this slideshow, correct? So that we can look at that. The maps are on the website. If you have questions, I think we have this time to submit to the superintendent. He can try to answer those before the presentation that we receive on Tuesday. If it's something that you think that the whole board would like to hear, make sure that he's aware of that. Like if you have a question before the meeting, please submit it to the superintendent so they can add that comment into their presentation so that it's answered when they're presenting to us as well. I just want to make sure people have time to kind of process this information, ask questions about it, because I do want to be mindful of our discussion time too. We have other things that we need to discuss, and we do have a week to process through this. Think about it, submit questions, and then have that presentation on Tuesday. Is there any other questions that the board has that they need answered tonight, or that will impact that presentation on Tuesday?
No, but Doug, can I just have you go back to the guiding principle slide again? I just want
Want the green check mark?
this one.
Yeah.
I'll just look at something real quick.
Well, I think somebody raised, while she's looking at that, I'll say this comment. Because I think somebody asked, and I don't know if I completely answered it or if not, about our administrators already are planning on what they can do to build the climate and the culture within their schools. They need to have that staff in place. Staff members need to know where they are. I think you know the passion that our staff has for taking care of kids. No matter who's coming to them, they're going to do what they can to take care of our students, take care of each other, because some of it's going to be a whole brand new school at Highview. Some of it's going to be, some staff members may choose to leave a school to go to Highview, so then you may have some new staff coming in. So it is a whole cultural component that impacts our families, our students, our families, and our staff as well. So they have to have that time to be able to do it. You can't do that in July and August and think that you're going to start a year moving those things forward.
Judy, did you have any
Nope.
questions on that?
Nope.
Terry's, we good?
No, let's go.
All right. All right, so right now we'll move on to item B, which is the READ Act Professional Development Plan, because we have some updates to the calendar. Is that you, Emily?
Yes, thank you so much. I'm happy to say that I have Sandy Georgie here with me today, who has done an extraordinary amount of work trying to figure out the best ways for us to meet the new legislation around the READ Act. So, as you know, that was recently passed. There are some fairly extensive requirements and things that we need to do as a district, and Sandy will cover those. I also want to add, while she is bringing forward our solution here, it really, her team looked at this thing every possible which way to try to figure out what is the best way organizationally we can do this and also meet the needs of the teachers and staff who will be required to participate in the training related to the READ Act. So I'll hand it over to Sandy as our resident READ Act expert.
Well, good evening all, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you regarding the READ Act and the professional learning plan and the calendar update and how Lakeville area schools will respond to that required legislation. As you know, the READ Act stands for Minnesota Reading to Ensure Academic Development, and this legislation was passed in May of 2023. It is replacing the Read Well by third grade, so that was sunsetted in July of 2023. And the goal of the READ Act is to ensure that every child is reading at or above grade level, and also to support multilingual learners and students receiving special education services. As Dr. McDonald mentioned, the READ Act has many components. It's a very robust piece of legislation. And the area that I will be addressing this evening is the component around professional learning. Within the READ Act, it is required by state law that all pre-K-12 teachers and instructional support staff who support reading interventions and provide reading instruction must be trained in the Minnesota Department of Education evidence-based reading instruction. The state of Minnesota outlined 3 professional development opportunities to be selected from, as well as one early childhood. Lakeville area schools will be moving forward with what is called CORE, which stands for Consortium of Reaching Excellence in Education, and particularly the course that is called Online Language and Literacy Academy. This particular learning experience is roughly around 45 to 60 hours of professional development. It includes 9 asynchronous modules and 3 synchronous sessions that would be virtual. The letters training, which is for early childhood, is roughly around 37 hours. It has 4 modules with 2 synchronous sessions that are each 6 hours in length, which could be divided into 4 3-hour sessions. So looking at all of the models, first of all, I want to give a big shout out to my team in the Elementary Teaching and Learning Department. They worked diligently as they were looking at all of the options. And we were really looking at options that would improve the overall effectiveness of the training, offering educators purposeful and collaborative professional learning time. We also were looking at options that were fiscally responsible, aligned to the current EML contract, and we're also within the guidelines for elementary of having 935 hours of instructional time. And so we looked at all of those pieces, as well as the professional plan that we have for math that we're rolling out at the same time at the elementary level. So the plan that I'm bringing forth to you to recommend is to utilize 2 PLCs per month, as well as the professional development days that we currently have in our calendar, which include 1 day in our calendar for the 24-25 school year, we only have one day that is outlined for professional development, and that is January 24th. So as you can imagine, we will need some more days to equate to 60 hours. So we will be looking at adjusting the calendar for a recommendation of adding 5 additional professional development days. You do have a calendar in front of you. You have both a student and staff calendar that Kim shared with you. And we would be tagging or linking those adjusted days to days that we already have built in the calendar as time off for our students. So the one you'll notice is October 21st. It is Monday. It's right next to the EM conference. Also with the addition of December 2nd, which is the Monday following Thanksgiving break. And then Friday, December 20th, which is prior to our winter break. And then Friday, February 14th, which is prior to President's Day. And then our extended spring break, which would be the addition of Monday, April 21st. With adjustment with that calendar, along with the 2 professional learning times per month, as well as we have identified 13 hours during workshop week, we feel we'd be able to meet those 60 hours that are required for that training for the READ Act.
So the one thing that I do want to add is that the dates that were chosen to switch from student contact to professional development were really strategic in the sense that we were thinking about, first of all, we can't expect our teachers to do 60 hours of PD outside of the duty day, right? Even if we pay people to do that, that is an extraordinary request and very invasive for people that have other things going on in their lives. So when we looked at the calendar, the first thing that we did was we wanted to make sure that we were meeting our required 935 hours of instructional time that the state requires us to do at the elementary level. So that was sort of step 1. And then step 2 was really to look at where do we place those days so that, again, it will be a disruption for families because the children will be home. But at the same time, how can we place them up against maybe another break to make it less disruptive? So it's not a day here, a day here, a day here. And then Sandy really looked at, we didn't want to create like 1-day weeks. So if we put it here, then they only have like 1 day of instruction, then they're off for the rest of the week. So there was definitely some thought in where those days were placed to try to be as accommodating as we can, not only for our staff, but for our families as well. Yes, Ken?
So I just have a couple questions here. When I think about professional development, particularly with teachers and implementing like what we're learning through professional development, first of all, is there a requirement to do all 60 hours that first year? And the reason I ask is because if we're doing all of this literacy training and the math at the same time, like how do you implement that with fidelity? I mean, my mind's gonna explode
Yes.
here. Like, I just can't imagine like trying to process all that information and then make the changes in your classroom.
Yes, point
Like,
of
that's-
clarification.
Yes, so thank you, Kim, for that question.
Okay.
You're absolutely right. So one of the things I want to share, maybe give some context, is that the core, the OLA training, the Online Language Literacy Academy, does need to be completed within that year. You might be thinking of the LETRS training, which is 180 hours, which the state has given a variance to do that over the course of 2 years.
Yes.
What the state has outlined are 2 phases of training. They have phase 1 and then phase 2. Phase 1 needs to be completed by July 1st, 2025, and that really is our K-3 teachers, as well as our pre-K through 12 special education teachers, our K-12 intervention teachers, as well as any instructional support. However, based on some new information from the state, they're going to be having additional guidance in the spring, so we're holding off on that until we receive that guidance from MDE. And then anyone that is in teaching and learning that supports any curriculum and instruction. Then phase 2 needs to occur by July 1st, 2027, and that includes our teachers in grades 4 through 12, as well as our secondary support, and teachers that are at our secondary level. So to your point, Kim, we'll be coming back with a calendar for not only this year, but then going through the calendar process for next year.
Okay.
Because K-3 teachers will be doing the READ Act PD, and our 4-5 teachers during this time will be doing the math implementation.
Okay.
Then in phase 2, where grades 4 and 5 are, by July 1st, 2027, we'll flip-flop. Then 4-5 will do the READ Act next year, and then K-3 will do the math implementation. So I appreciate that.
So maybe just to clarify, are you talking all teachers, or are you talking elementary teachers for these days? Because I think you have.
Yeah, so for the recommendation for next year for phase 1 is elementary, except for the exception for special education, which is pre-K-12. And then we do have a plan for those teachers that are at the secondary level who would need to be able to do that training within their contract work time, which would be release time rather than professional development, or rather than these PD in-service days that we have for the elementary calendar.
Yeah, the big difference is that at the elementary, all staff
Yes.
have to be trained. So at the secondary, it's more specialized. So if you teach English, if you're an English interventionist, those types of things. And the secondary, most of the secondary staff don't need to be trained until 2027.
So clarify again, what are they doing on those PD days, the secondary staff?
They don't have PD days. They
Oh,
will be,
so this is only elementary?
They will have the calendar that was approved,
Okay.
they will work that. We did have a lot of conversation about that. The challenge is that, of course, we can always use more PD time. It doesn't matter what level you are. We are not in a space currently to be able to provide more professional development time at the secondary and meet our instructional hours requirement
Right.
of 1,020 hours. So,
Okay.
so that was our conversation. Do we just make the shift right now for the elementary? And again, this is all new territory for us, so we're trying to just figure out what is our highest level, what's our best plan to be most effective and efficient, to be able to make sure that our teachers that are required to be trained in phase 1
Right.
have the opportunity to do that and engage in the learning in a meaningful way, so.
Okay.
So on the calendar, we'll probably have to reflect that
Yes,
it's.
so the one that will come
Yeah.
to the, on the consent agenda next week will specify, so that will be clear, that it's
Okay.
an elementary. The calendar remains the same. The difference is that at the elementary, days are shifted to professional development, not at the secondary.
And I'm sure you already stated this, but just to clarify, like, these days that you've added in, these weren't days that teachers had off, like,
No.
okay, all right.
They
so-
were student contact, unfortunately,
It's just
you know,
student
it's like
contact
that's the
days.
trade-off is that we had to take back, we have been above the required hours of
Right.
the state, so we were in a good space there at the elementary, and we could
Okay.
make that shift.
But this
So we
just
have-
puts us just at it now, right? Are we
No,
still
so
above it?
We have 15 buffer days to work
Okay,
with
we
at
did.
the elementary.
Oh.
We still do.
So we still have plenty, even
Okay.
if we utilize the 5, we will have 10 buffer days still
Okay.
within that 935.
Okay.
So how many
Good
days
question.
do elementary students normally get? I mean, if it weren't for this? Because
So-
you're telling me these hours, I'm just curious, like, is it
Yeah, our calendar-
175 days or?
Our calendar, generally when we do our calendar committee planning, we always want to land between 160 and 172. That's been historically where we've been. Part of it is dependent on where like days land, you know, and how many days we can get in. So there is a slight, I would say generally speaking, we're around 170. That's pretty standard for our area in terms of the number of days that are taught. What happens is because our elementary teachers and our secondary teachers are contractually the same, so, and the state requires fewer hours for the elementary. Our elementary students just have the benefit of additional instructional
Got
time,
it.
which is really
So,
nice.
but past years, every kindergarten kid every elementary student before next year has historically had 170 days worth of education.
Approximately, yes.
So then, how many days will they have with this new, with the requirement for the next
They'll
2
have
years?
6 fewer days.
Actually, 5 fewer days.
5 fewer days.
Five.
So
Excuse me, yeah.
so 165, so.
Yes, because we have 1 day already.
Got it, got it.
Thank you, Sam.
Okay. And so then, so we're losing 5 contact days for elementary students. for the professional development, is there additional costs that we need to be aware of, or is this all, like, is it a net neutral for the overlap of the different PD, or does that come from a different bucket? How does that work?
Bill? Well.
Like, how do we pay for this?
Are you going to talk about that in the finance update, or is this a separate
Well,
question?
it's,
So
I'm
the-
kind
Yeah,
of
go
curious
ahead.
about it because
I
it's an
can-
unfunded mandate that we got.
Well, it's a partially
Partially
funded,
funded.
it's a partially funded mandate. And so the state will work until they no longer have funds to pay for the professional development. So it's about $630 for the course, and the state reimburses for that. So we are in the process right now of registering. So as of now, the way the legislation is written, that cost is covered by the READ Act. And because we're using these professional development days, we don't need to stipend our teachers. It's part of their contract. So our teachers will still work 186 days, so that will not increase. So that will be cost neutral.
So that's part of the trade-off, is we lose student contact days in order, otherwise, if we were adding additional days, we'd be paying for those additional days in the teacher contract.
Wasn't some of this budgeted? Did we calculate some of this into the budget?
Yes, we do.
Okay.
But it's next year, it's not this year.
Oh, next year's.
So it's part of that forecast we're talking about
Yeah.
tonight. So the true cost here, even though we've covered our elementary teachers, it's gonna be our secondary special ed teachers who still we'll still have students that
Yeah.
For next year. And so the $630 that we may get reimbursed may not be there in year 2, or even year 1, depending, I mean, how much do they have in this bucket? Just, I mean, is it enough to cover all staff, or
The
we don't
READ
know?
Act specifically states that there may be costs that will not be covered. And currently, the legislators are looking at a READ Act called 2.0. And in that conversation, they're looking at additional funding for the professional development and for the curriculum, and then also to address the professional learning for our support staff. So those are the 3 main areas that they're looking at, as well as addressing it through licensing and teacher prep. So hopefully, eventually, this would not be something that the districts would have to take on. Teachers would have this on their license through PELSB. And so those are some of the new things that are in the potential bill moving forward for the READ Act 2.0.
And how many staff do we have impacted in year 1? Do we have a ballpark?
555. That includes early childhood, as well as our special education at the secondary level.
Okay.
Give or take,
Yeah.
plus or minus
Okay,
5.
plus or minus.
So we run the risk of 555, 600 times $630 potentially, because there is no guarantee that we may get that. So, but we're submitting the reimbursement now so that we can hopefully be the first.
We complete the registration.
Yeah.
I don't have any reason to think otherwise during
Yep.
this round.
Got it, yep. All right.
The first year is more likely to be covered
Yep.
than going forward. The other thing, there are some districts that already have some professional development that's similar to what we're gonna be doing. They already are paying for it themselves. Some districts had already started that process and actually have already started some of the training. The issue for us will also be, how does the state roll that training out to us? Because there's not a guarantee that they're gonna say December 2nd is the exact date that they're now gonna do training. So we're gonna have to figure out how we get our folks trained, and Sandy can talk to that.
So we have this plan, and we will be at the will of the national training. The part that we have already planned for is there are 3 synchronous sessions. Myself and my team are going through what's called online cohort training, which is 70 hours of training, and we start in 2 weeks. What that will allow us is to run the synchronous sessions. So if we submit the date on our 3 synchronous sessions and they're not available by the national cohort, then we can step in, the 4 of us can step in and help make sure that that happens. So we are working for that flexibility. That is not covered by the READ Act for us to be trained. And that training is about $1,600 per person. And then myself and 3 of my team members will start that training March 11th to allow flexibility if these cohorts don't allow for the days that we have.
Yeah, we're covering that through our adjusted, reallocated, our professional development budget, and that's exactly what the professional development budget is for, is only for to provide training for staff, so.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
So we have a contingency plan, hopefully.
Any further questions on the calendar?
Thank you.
Thanks,
Okay,
Andy.
thank you. The last item we have for upcoming recommendations is a review and revised budget and the budget projection, and that is by Bill.
Yes, good evening.
Is that going to be up here, or?
It will pop up in a second.
Okay.
Okay. As you know, each year, once we've got everybody hired and we got through our audit, we bring you a revised budget. There's always, when we bring that June budget to you, there's a lot of assumptions in that budget. And now we're pretty clear of what we're spending this year. So tonight, we're going to touch on the enrollment. We talked about that a little bit already tonight with the boundary adjustment. And then we'll talk about a revised budget, do a quick overview. Then we'll talk about assumptions going forward and look at a 5-year forecast. Again, when we're budgeting, we've been running about 2% this year, just a tiny bit under. And as we go forward, it jumps back over 2% again. We're using the blue line, not the red line. That red line is some variables as we look at housing gains. But we don't know exactly what those are, so to be conservative, we are using the blue line. And just as we've looked at this in the past, just kind of a reminder, you can see at our elementary, we consider that's running over 2.5% on a yearly basis. And as you see in the middle school, in the center there, that the last few years have been pretty flat. We really haven't seen any changes, but that's where our pressure is. We look at 25, 26, and really start to see the pressure at the middle school level. So that's why we've been talking about facilities, and that's why we're talking about middle school right there. Where you look at the high school again, right now, we don't have a big growth. 3 years through middle school for the high school, you see that part of the years out. We start to see considerable increases at the high school.
Can you go back to that? Previous slide. And that line that you have going across, that's our capacity and.
That's,
That's projected growth. Oh, the line on
this
the.
line is just where we are right now.
The line
This
is
line, see it matches up with the 24 number?
Got
This
it.
is on each one,
Yeah.
the line is today's enrollment.
Got it, but
Oh,
do you have another line that shows capacity of our buildings and where we're at? Or no? Because this tells me this, all right, that's where we're at, so we're gonna have more in the next, all right, I'll take that offline.
Yeah, I guess we'll talk about capacity at a different time.
Yeah.
I mean, for example, though, at our middle school, Century Middle School right now is full. Okay, so any increases we're gonna get there, they're gonna be feeling it.
Yeah.
Now, first I want to talk about what's happened with our revenue since last June. So you see we have our preliminary budget numbers there and our new numbers. So you see some small increases here since we had last year. Now, when we look at local other, that's fees people pay, that's interest we receive, things like that. And that $500,000, that 500,000 is almost entirely interest. Our fund balance has improved, and of course, the interest rates have improved. So we're seeing a nice increase in those funds coming in. And we look at state sources, we're up 2.4 million from last June, and we'll go through those in detail in a minute. But you see that property tax, of course, hasn't changed. We put that in place in December of 2022. So that's what the money's being collected now. And then federal sources, again, we're looking at what we're actually spending. That's a reimbursement piece, so we get reimbursed for what we spend. And we're looking at spending 3.2 this particular year. When we look at just the state funding now this year, you can see the state funding has gone up $200,000. This is really due to county apportionment and some TRA funding. So not a big number, but it's positive. LEP from the last legislative session, we have another 100,000 there. There's an endowment at the state of Minnesota, which they spread out to all school districts. We never know that in June, but you see we have $100,000 there, so that's good news. We have some restricted new revenue, the library aid, support personnel. We didn't know what those numbers were back in June, so it's 400,000 for those pieces. Unemployment, we've talked about unemployment many, many times of what our responsibility is. This is looking at spending $1 million in this fiscal year for the new unemployment piece. Of course, the bad thing is we're spending that too, even though we've got the reimbursement here of $1 million. Special education, another piece that moves around a lot as we go through the fall, and all schools put in their final numbers. So our new report from them is up $600,000. So that's great news for special ed department.
Bill, just to make sure everybody understands, that unemployment money is money in, money out.
Correct.
It's not money that's sitting there. It's money we already had to expend. We're asking for reimbursement.
So when you look at that $2.4 million new state money, there's not much there to touch to do anything new. It's all tied to something else.
Okay, so are these new categories, LEP, endowment, are those a one-time, or are they recurring revenue that we're getting, or is it just kind of like, hey, here's $600,000 for this year?
It's all recurring.
Okay.
LEP, there's new funding from the state of Minnesota at a higher level than it was in the past. And the restricted revenue pieces I listed there, actually we see some growth in that in the future besides what's there. So that's good news. Unemployment, the problem with unemployment, we know that that's only funded for a period of time, and eventually that's going to be an expense that we will have without reimbursement. When we look at the other piece, really nothing's changed there. When we look at our non-public, our health and safety and so forth, and a compensatory.
When you say that's an expense, like, we don't know that for sure, that we won't continue to get reimbursement. I mean, we know there would have to be another decision made to continue.
Right. We know that the state of Minnesota has put $135 million aside for this, and at this point when it's gone, it's gone. But could they make a decision to do something different?
It would take legislative action.
Right.
That's what it would take.
Okay, so that's the changes from last spring. We'll go through our revenues, talk about how it compares to what we had in '23. We know these final numbers now. Overall, our local is down a little bit at $400,000 from the previous year. Our state sources, of course, we'll go through these in details again here in a minute, but moving up $17.3 million. And again, this is the biggest increase we've ever had. Property tax for next year, we'll go through those in details too. $7.4 million. And our federal sources, you're seeing shrinking from '23, and that's because our COVID dollars really are drying up now. There's some really small amounts that we can use going to next year, but it's pretty much gone. So that 3.2, what you're seeing there, that's our title programs, and that's our federal special ed program. So we look at our state dollars. We know that we receive 4% on the formula allowance from the state of Minnesota. That generates $4 million for the school district. So that is new money for '24. We have a growth piece. We have 200 new students. Actually, I think we're at 204 right now. So we get about $1.5 million generated with that formula allowance from new students, which is for new staff. Special education, you see the aid there is up $3 million. And we have some enrollment growth also there, which generates not a lot of money for us, about $200,000. And then the cross-subsidy aid that we talked about, that's $5.9 million on the last report from the state of Minnesota. ELL, up $100,000. Compensatory, this is an area where we were very concerned that we were going to lose money in this area. They're looking at the compensatory in a different way, or there's more people being counted at the county level, and we're getting those direct. So we're seeing a small increase there, and very good news. Again, the new restricted revenue for the student support, personnel, library aid, that's a $400,000 we talked about. And then unemployment again, and then LTFM. We get a very small amount of aid in LTFM from the state of Minnesota. They're $300,000. Now, we look at property taxes, a 7.4 increase from the previous year. This, the referendum is really anything that we have is unrestricted. We have an increase there of $3.3 million from fiscal '23. I just want to make a small point here that next year, we're actually going to see this number not as large. Even though we've passed a new operating levy for the new building at $1.3 million, this is actually going to, the increase is going to shrink because we have a lot of past inflation built in here from the state of Minnesota, and the inflation rates have really come down. This past year, we ended up at 3.2. The previous year, it was close to 10%. So that is falling down to where it was in the past. In the current year we just started, inflation is projected at 2.3. So we'll see how that turns out. So that's going to be a smaller number. I just want everybody to be aware of that. Again, of course, referendum is based on how many students we have. And so the new staff are being covered there with $600,000 in that referendum. And then our assigned components, you remember there's many components that we get levy-wise. The other side of our unemployment, we have vocational aid, we have our, quite a few pieces. Well, you look at the next section there too, we got the operating capital, the LTFM, the capital projects levy, those are all levy components that of course are restricted and we can't use it. And then we have some prior year adjustments at $1.8 million. Of course, that's another thing that won't be there coming up next year. So a lot smaller growth. I'll look at the expenditure side. You see now the budget, looking at $500,000 in the administration, $200,000 in district support, $3.9 million in regular education, vocational at $100,000, special education at $3 million. You see community education here, that hasn't been there in the past, but that's the unemployment we have to pay for community at $100,000. And then, of course, instructional support services, you see actually a small decrease. Usually you don't see a decrease in our expenditures. That's because when we go out with any type of a new lease, last year we went out for a very large lease for new devices for our students. That has come off. So that's why you're seeing a decrease there, but that was about $5 million. So actually increased, with our regular program, up about $3 million. Pupil support services, you'll see there an increase of $300,000. Here's where we saw a little bit of savings, but because of our busing contract, we have seen an increase here. And the sites and buildings, of course. A lot going on. Our that fiscal and fixed costs are really our insurance programs. And actually, we have some good news there. Workman's comp, those rates have come down quite a bit because our audits come down. We have less experience in this positive effect. So you see there are increase in this year from fiscal '23 in our general fund expenditures at $5.4 million. So just to get a bit of a perspective of where the money comes from, you can see that the state by far sends us the most funds that we use. When you look at the property tax that you pay, that's about 25% of our budget. On the expenditure side, you see that the elementary, secondary education, vocational, special education, and all our instructional support are part of the majority of the budget, not going to our students. So, budget for this year, you see revenues, they're at $198,000, we're just under $200 million. And then the expenditures at $197. So, and looking at our fund balance, they're to increase approximately $4 million from the previous year. Student nutrition fund, you see an increase there of just under $500,000. This is a very healthy fund balance in our food service. As I said in the past, we've used some funds here where we can in other areas, like in the new building, we've used this fund to pay for all their new equipment. There's a limit, we can only have six months of expenditures in this fund, and you see that we're spending about $8 million, so about $4 million is all we can get up to. So again, very healthy. Community education, you see there, I still have a projected fund balance of negative $300,000. They're making strides.
Slowly closing the gap.
It's slowly.
They had a big hole.
But the positive is they are they are recovered. Our building fund, of course, you see under the other financing, that's the bonds we sold last fall for the LTFM. But we're between LTFM and the new building, spending $23 million in that area. Debt service, you see there, a change in our fund balance of a negative $1 million. We talked about that. We get to a certain point with our fund balance and debt service. We don't need that much, so it goes back to the taxpayer, and that's what's happening. Trust fund, that's all our scholarships. Pretty much stays, what these are, the scholarships where people have given money to the school district that we just use any interest that we gain for scholarships. And that principal of that base stays there. So that's why you're seeing the 860 remaining. And then an internal service fund, that's our health insurance program. You see we built that up. Now I think we're just into our 4th year. Being self-insured, that's built up to just under $7 million. And we're looking at that going up to about 7.6. The goal there is to get approximately 25% into a fund balance of our usage. That would have to be right around $8 million. So we're getting very, very close to where I think we can really do some more work with trying to keep our insurance increases a little bit lower. So that's all positive. So here's what our fund balance looks like. You can see our volume, of course, is up 197, but are moving up to that $4 million mark at 2%. And just a reminder, the fund balance from the board policy is 5%. Okay, let's talk about assumptions going into the next few years. Enrollment, when we look at our enrollment, we continue to grow about 2%. It's actually a little bit conservative, more like 2.1. But we want to be conservative in this budget to make sure that we're not in a situation where we're short of funds. Stated formula allowance, we know for 25 it's 2%. For 26, there is a new legislation that if inflation is higher than 2%, we would get more than 2%, up to 3%. So these are, if inflation does get going, we can get up to 3. But of course, we're going to put 2 in here. We know it. We know that is for 25. There's no variance in that, just the 25 year. Operating levy using that same increase. As you know, we have an inflation factor in our operating levies. Before this inflation period, we ran about 1.92% on a yearly basis. Enrollment, again, running about 2%. Of course, we put in our new operating levy for Highview, $100 new dollars per pupil unit. Of course, that generates us $1.3 million. And then using 2% also for our special ed. Special ed sometimes runs a little higher than what we're eligible for reimbursement. And of course, we have, as an assumption, renewal of all our current levies. Some of our current levies now are starting to get quite a few dollars tied to them. So here they are listed here, but just want you to be aware, especially when you look at that 2017 referendum, $900 per pupil unit. That's about half right now. We're a little bit over $1,800 per pupil unit. You see that generates $11.8 million. So it's very important that we have that in that year. That's our base. And it's coming up in just a few years. We look at the expenditure side. Programming, when we look at this budget, we're going ahead with programming the way it is now. There's no built-in change with the way that we're doing business. If something, the board decided to do something different, but we would have to rerun this because right now we're just bringing everything forward the way it is now. Of course, we're including the new money that we're going to hire the new staffing at Highview at $1.3 million. And then we're using these same percentages. So enrollment growth at 2%. We're looking at staffing matching what we're getting from the state of Minnesota at 2%. And then our benefit inflation runs a little bit higher, especially with our health insurance, but we're really looking at hopefully that's going to be lower very near future. And then purchase services, supplies, and so forth at 2%. Taking all those things in consideration, we are looking at the next 5 years of having our revenues a little bit higher than expenditures. It's nothing extraordinary. It's something that's going in the right way. But as I said before, remember that our fund balance policy is 5%. And even after 5 years, we're not at that 5%. At the same time, I do want to say this is a conservative budget. It could be better. I don't expect it to be worse. is just now to look at breaking down our fund balances. As you know, we have restricted fund balances, we have non-spendable fund balances, and of course, our unassigned. But looking at 4.2% after 5 years. That gives you just a picture of what's happening. We'll be starting immediately to work on our fiscal year 25 budget. And of course, it's hard to get going because we don't know where the staffing is going to be because we need the boundaries drawn. You know, we need the busing routes and all those things. So we'll be bringing that to you as soon as we have information. With all that said, is there any questions? So the small increase, the small changes we saw on the front end, we'll bring our revised budget to you next week. And we'll run through some of the details again for the public to hear.
So I've got a couple questions, maybe more some observations, just so that I'm clear and understand. And so the 24 budget, we're projected to have about 3.9. I think we've got a grid or an Excel spreadsheet that showed that. $3.9 million.
Actually, if you want to see that too, it is in your book.
Got it.
Page 7.
Yeah.
Well, that's got all of them in more detail on page.
Okay. So we're going to have we're projected to have about $3.9 million in our savings account again. Goal is to have roughly 10%, so roughly of your expenditure. So we want $20 million in our savings account. We've only got 4, which is what, 20%. So if you have $1,000, you've got what, $200? Well, that's not good math. Sorry,
Well,
I didn't go to Lakeville.
4 after 5 years, right? 4.2% after 5 years.
The number right here is about 2% of our budget.
2%. Yeah.
Okay.
So we're still $16 million short. Bottom line, from where we
Of the fund balance.
of the fund balance of where we want to be. So I just want to be mindful, like obviously over the next 5 years, as our expenditures also increase, the delta of trying to catch up is going to be harder. And so I think, and I just think out loud, like last year we cut $7 million in a bunch of services and programs, and just for food for thought for us internally within the board, and also for you guys to think about, like all these kids that are going through the program or going through our school system, they're not getting the kind of services that we had last year. And so knowing that we're not going to hit 4% in 5 years, like how many kids are we impacting over this 5-year span, like trying to hit that number? And so I'm torn at times where, do you invest? Do you accept, like, all right, we've got to put services back that we cut, or do you let things as is, trying to get that 4 million, that 4% number target? I don't know the answer, but those are things that we should probably eventually talk about. So just want to acknowledge that.
So can I add on to that, Brian? So look at page 20 in here, the finance profile and benchmarks. This is the metro area, so 23, looks like 23 or 24 school districts in the metro area. And to that point, Brian, we're the 8th largest in size. And in expenditures, we rank number 12 with what we expend out, but in revenues, we're 20. So we bring in a lot less than what a lot of our metro school districts do. I don't know, I think I heard what you were saying, but I think we need to me, I think this, to be optimal, wouldn't you think that you need to be more?
We need to bring in more revenue if we want to be able to do other things. So
Correct.
I know that we had levy 1 passed, and I believe there was a previous grid that showed that we can tax, or a school district has the authority to tax up to, what, $2,050 per pupil. I believe that was the metric.
Because of the interest change, I think it's about 2,300.
About 20, how much?
2,300.
2,300? Okay.
And we're at 18.
And we're at 18. So the community, or as a board, or as a school district, we're missing out on $500 per pupil if from a levying point of view, correct?
We're not missing out, we haven't asked for
We haven't
it.
asked
Yeah.
for that additional funding.
Correct.
And so if we did, we'd be at where probably everyone else is at in regards to additional funding. Okay. All right, so there's an opportunity to think through around how to close that gap. Funding, increasing the fund balance, but also bringing things back where it makes sense for what we can do. The second thing that I want to just highlight that I think is super important is, if you go back to your revenue grid, you showed a grid that said we brought in $176 million in 2023, or was that 2022-ish?
23.
23, okay. And then we brought in 198 million in 24. So that's a huge $22 million difference in revenue. What I don't understand is like, why were we spending $191 million in 23? I mean, because if we only brought in 176, we spent $15 million more than we had budgeted for, and now, so if it weren't for this massive $22 million, revenue that we got from the state, we'd be very unfavorable, I would assume. And so,
Well, let's remember that the budget was showing that we're overspending. That's not a surprise to anybody. We budgeted, we knew we were overspending, and it's been multiple years. Okay. We had to do the cuts to balance the budget.
right. So if we did
Over the years, that's why the expenditures were higher than the revenue, because we were overspending.
got it. So if we didn't do the budget cuts, we would have spent $204 million this year versus $197 million. And so then we would have like even $0.
Wages were always higher.
Have we always spent $191 million? I mean, I'm just,
Oh, no, it just grows every year.
Yep.
okay.
There was proposed.
And I mean, there's two pieces driving those amounts. Number one is our enrollment. We have more students to serve on a yearly basis. Plus, we get that about 2% new money from the state of Minnesota on a yearly basis.
Yeah.
But if you remember, it's not on this chart, but there's the chart he showed you before where I think the fund balance was 5 or 6 years ago, 12 or 13%.
Yeah.
And then it gradually got spent down to where it was last year, where when I walked in and other people walked in, were like, we're not going to hit our 5% mark, and then substantially below that. So I think to your point, and without making adjustments, we'd be, the state would be having some
Yeah.
heavy conversations
We'd be
with
over
us.
budget. I mean, again, if the projections was, yeah, that makes sense.
Even with the cross subsidy for special ed, we're still drastically below.
But that didn't close it, that just
No, I'm
helped,
saying,
yeah.
It was 6 million of what we.
It was-
overspent, like
it was
16 or
15 or 16 million.
right?
15 million and we got 6.
A huge part of our overspending is special ed. We give a much higher percentage of special ed.
Yeah. Which makes sense, yeah. So we spent $191 million last year. We're anticipating us spending $197 million this year, and we're bringing in about 198 from the state, or for revenues.
For all of it.
For all revenues,
Yep.
got it. So just want to be clear, the $22 million difference is to really close the gap of us overspending. Well, not overspending, but the
Spending down the fund balance.
Well, you got $191, that's overspending, I
Yep,
see that.
yep.
I mean, if you only bring in 174, why did we spend 191? So, in 2023, all right.
One thing that has, I feel like come up in our conversations was the READ Act and what was gonna play out with all this. So do we know more about, is that money, because I get confused about like professional development money and where it comes from. So is it covered in the professional development money we have, or this comes?
The state of Minnesota hasn't even told us how they want us to code it. The information we get from the state of Minnesota on the READ Act, on any type of revenue we get, they say it's going to be deeply, deeply going. We have no idea how many dollars are coming. We have no idea. Keep waiting
We
for
know
it.
what it's gonna cost us, we just don't know how
We don't
much.
even know what it's going to cost.
Well, yeah,
us.
I guess we don't.
We have an idea now on the training side.
Right.
We still got the whole curriculum side.
But there's still
We know we have
more.
to hire new employees.
Right.
All those pieces.
Yeah, so Carly, to your point, there's the professional development, which they have communicated will be funded for the professional development activities. That's the $630, whatever, that Sandy mentioned earlier. So we won't incur that cost, at least in this phase one, because we don't know, they haven't communicated, or somebody asked, is it until it's done, until everyone's trained, or is it gonna last a year and then we have to pick that up? We do not have the resources in our professional development fund to be able to provide, if we had to pay for that training. So, but the training is only one component of the READ Act. So the other two components are the curriculum, which they are making decisions on, related to what we can and can't use for curriculum. They're gonna tell us. So if what we currently have doesn't align to that, we're looking at a significant, over $1 million investment. I think last time we adopted elementary ELA, it was $1.5 million. Bill, I don't know if you can, somewhere in that neighborhood though. I mean, it's not, because it's for all elementary staff. The second part then is also related to assessments, and we think we're probably okay there. They've identified those assessments and what we're doing. We made some shifts a couple years ago that really align to that, so we don't think we're gonna incur any significant expense there. But then the other piece of the READ Act is that we didn't even talk about is that there are requirements that we hire reading specialists in the district. So that will be an add in terms of staff, which will be reoccurring year upon year upon year. We don't have full clarity on what that looks like. Are we talking 2 people? Are we talking 1 for every building? So we're still looking at that, but that will be a significant expense as well. That to this point, there has been no discussion or commitment for any type of reimbursement in any of those areas except for around the professional development.
So didn't we have a reading specialist and they got cut last year?
We didn't have a reading specialist. We have, we have a variety of things happening in the district. We have some, we do have in our ADSIS buildings, we have some academic and behavior support folks. We had a dyslexia specialist because a number of years ago, they shifted the legislation around dyslexia, and we had to not only train staff, but we had to put in all assessments and other things. So we brought a person on to be able to help lead some of that work around dyslexia, because that also had a professional development component that wasn't funded at that time. So it was actually better for us to hire a person in-house to do that work around dyslexia than to like try to send everybody out to do that. So yeah, I mean, we have people that have reading licenses for sure. But it's not one of those, it is one of those situations where it will be an addition to what we're already doing, because there's not really a place where we can take away.
I guess my question is, we have all of these supports within like the teaching and learning department. Like we have people that are doing curriculum, so, and we have people with reading licenses, and I'm wondering, you know, how the READ Act comes out with that, or what the qualifications will be for that person. But couldn't we just redistribute like our teaching and learning people and say, you are doing the reading because that's what we need right now?
Well, the reality, I think, is that the people currently in those jobs are already extraordinarily busy, and we've had conversations at this table, particularly around what's happening for elementary staff, where it's year upon year upon year of new standards, like the state just can't, you know, hasn't taken a pause, and then all of the other pieces, you know, the SEL work, our equity work, all of those pieces have to be led and managed and supported. So from a capacity standpoint, to add a whole nother job serving every elementary and potentially secondary in the district is likely not feasible under those conditions. So, I mean, we will look at everything from a system. We've done a couple of reorganizations over the past 5-6 years to try to make sure that we are strategically placed to be able to best support staff. And certainly we will have those conversations, but we need to know more. And I don't want to divert the conversation back to the READ Act, but it is like, these are the things that we just, it's nebulous right now, and so we can only plan so far and take some things into account to what we know and try to project what that might look like from a budgetary standpoint. So
from a board member, I'm just looking at this going, yep, we're overspending every year, so where do we cut the budget to make sure that we're not overspending every year? Because we continue to have the same conversation and our fund balance isn't going to.
It's not gonna go anywhere.
There are 2 options. Either we reduce our reduce our expenditures in other areas, or you go to levy and increase your taxing capacity up to 2,300 from the 1,800 that we're in today. If you got there's a $500 delta, times that by 11,800 kids that we've got. That's an extra $6 million in revenue that we're not getting, that other schools may be getting. And so those are things that I think we should probably explore. But again, we can't get that
or we're not going to receive that unless the community approves the things that we need to do. So, but as it sits right now, from a revenue point of view, you're bringing in 198, you're spending 197, like, it's gonna take forever to get past 4%.
But it's better than spending $5 million more than.
Yes,
than you
that
have.
is better than, yeah, I mean, if it weren't for the $7 million cut last year, we'd be spending $204 million, and then we would be in the negatives, $5 million.
Right. Do we have any more questions on the budget at this point? Okay, thank you, Bill. All right, so we'll move on. We have 3 items for discussion tonight, and I do want to be mindful of time, trying to keep some of those things concise. We have a report from the treasurer. Brian?
Oh, yeah, yes. I've got 2 topics that I think we should probably just discuss as a board. One, I had a chance to, over January, connect with some of the finance folks, just to learn more about how are things and the way they operate. At a super high level, one of the things that I want to make sure that we can focus on this year is providing better, or not better, but more transparency and awareness around financial metrics and where they are at, so that we can provide identify trends sooner than later. And so what I understand, and Bill, you feel free to correct me, is that we are limited to certain financial systems due to the integration that they have to have with the state system. And so those financial systems, let's just say, aren't as configurable, customizable, and in regards to some of their reporting capabilities and forecasting capabilities. And so I don't have an answer, and I do not work in the education field, but I feel like there may be an opportunity to explore other avenues around what can we do, what other systems can we consider, how do we operationalize, how do we modernize, so that we've got more real-time data, real-time metrics, so that we've got that visibility when things may be going in a different direction that we want. And so this is our second update on the budget. Our first one was back in July-ish or so. Maybe this might be the third update. Maybe in December we might have had another one. Yep, right. Yep. And so, number one, I want to be super clear. And acknowledge that the team that Bill has, they're operating in a manner that's within the constraints that they're allowed to amongst in the systems that they have. And so what I propose is and I don't have an answer for this one, but I'd like to suggest that we go to RFP for, is there another consultant or an audit or some sort of agency that can come in and take a look at how we're operating today, less about what things are categorized, but look at the people, look at the process, look at the technology, and say, here's what they would recommend, additional things that we can do that give us more flexibility for more real-time monitoring of the reports. That's what I would recommend, because the data's there. The data is just in a source that we may not have access to configure. Right now, there's an Excel spreadsheet, right, that the team uses mostly in forecasting. I mean, you've got one that has.
Yeah, that's pretty much what we use. We dump the data into a spreadsheet.
Yep.
So we can have a look at where we are. When we look at each year, we look at how far during the year, like end of December, we're 6 months into the year. So as a percentage of how much we spent the year before, are we spending the same amount?
Yeah.
That's really the only area or matrix we have. So that's what we look at. If we're spending way more in an area, then that's a problem. But we look at every line item. I mean, we roll it up.
How many are there, ballpark, like in that spreadsheet? Like, there's a lot.
Well, our code's close to 10,000 lines.
Yeah,
Okay.
in a spreadsheet.
Oh my gosh, okay.
Yeah, so my recommendation is, like, again, I'm not saying that there is a solution, but I feel like there may be an opportunity to take a look at, are there things that we could operationalize or transform? Because the data elements are there. I mean, in my corporate profession, you can take the data elements, add it to a financial tool, whether it be Domo, Tableau, and Adobe, whatever you want to call it, to kind of like give us that real-time vision. Right now, it says that here's our budget for the year, and we've spent 62% of what we spent last year, in that particular number. There is no way for me to show, or let me rephrase that. at this time, there isn't a tool that tells me how much do I plan to spend this month? How much did I spend this month? What is the delta? And then do I anticipate a variance over the next coming months? Like, there isn't a tool that allows that capability today.
So can I ask a question? So I'm trying to put this in like simpler terms.
Yes.
So what you're looking for is more of like a program that would help manage the data that we have, that would give us a month by month outlook instead of, like, is that like it?
Yes,
Because
I
I'm
think-
trying to
yes.
think like, so we had to do a $7 million budget cut, right?
Yep.
And thinking about like, wow, would have been nice to know about that back here. Would this be something that would help in predicting those types of things?
Yeah. And I think some of those alarms may have already been done, but something
Okay.
more monthly cadence, because the current, I mean, yes, that's what I'm looking for. I
Okay.
think that's what, in my opinion, that is what we need to kind of make sure that, not transform, but to enhance our reporting capabilities based on the limitations that I understand it today.
Would that help your team?
Well, I guess a couple of things I want to say. First of all, when we look at our budget, we look at it a year at a time. We don't look at it a month, right? Because once we hire our staff in September, it doesn't change. We have the same people. Even if we had a whole bunch of, 500 students moved out, we couldn't change our staff. We couldn't do it, right? So
Right.
we just budget at a year at a time. And that's why, and then at the same time, each building gets allocated funds, right? We don't know what month they're going to spend those funds. So I have no way to do a monthly budget. We're going to see variances all over the place because that cyclical way they expend isn't the same on a yearly basis. It changes. And the way the state gives us money changes. We don't get the same amount each month. It's
So-
always different.
So my question would be, seeing those variances, you're not going to be able to control them.
Yeah, but you should-
Because when the state pays you differently, when we project electric use in a building, we take a 3 or 4 year snapshot of what do we normally spend, and that's what we try to budget with an increase in there. But, like, for example, when it's 60 degrees outside, our heaters and boilers aren't running, we haven't had to push too much snow this year, so there's going to be variance in there that aren't necessarily controllable, even if you see them. I can't control if it's going to be 20 below. You're going to have to pay the electric bill when the electric bill comes due. You can't say, oh, all of a sudden now we're going to have to make that adjustment. I think that's what Bill's trying to say, is that when you put those things in place, to what you said, Kim, people did see that was being spent down for 5 or 6 years, that fund balance, to get to where they were. So knowing those variances went to stop that process unless the board said, hey, we're not going to overspend that particular budget. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Because it was there, Bill shares his projections of where those things are and where those fund balances are
When you
going
go
to
back
be.
5 years, the budgets that were presented were deficit budgets. It wasn't like a surprise at the end of the year, oh, we overspent. We knew we were overspent every single year, even this past year. It was not a surprise we overspent $7 million. I told you we were overspending $7 million. It's not a surprise.
I was surprised.
Well, and I think
It's been there all along.
to Brian's question, we can look at other systems, but there's only a couple of systems that link to the state. And they don't necessarily give you the flexibility, like, one of them is about $250,000 more than what we spend now, and you're not gonna get any more functionality, from my understanding of it, than what we have with the current system that we have. So you still have to be in compliance with what the state expects to be able to communicate through a system. I didn't mean, I think that's part of
There's actually 5
it.
systems that we can use.
So I'm not proposing that you change systems. What I'm proposing is that the data elements are there for what you're trying to track. So can that go to a different system where you can have all the configurability and better monitoring metrics so that we know when things may be going in the wrong direction? And you're right. You can look at the past 5 years and say, hey, here's how much we spent the past 5 years, but every year is different. So what we need to do is make sure that if we forecast $1 million for next year, and again, it's going to be different from next year because we're going to have more kids, we're going to have less kids, or X, Y, Z. The previous budgets aren't really going to matter, but what you spent in each month in those previous years, you can aggregate that and say, hey, in the month of November, we normally spend 15% of our budget. In the month of December, we normally spend 40% of our budget, whatever it may be. But and so can you use those data elements to get a better picture, a more monthly picture of where we're at. That's my recommendation based on my experience. You guys can decide if we should go to RFP for a process, the people, the technology, better reporting. That's my recommendation.
So you're asking for an independent platform that we take the data that we have, dump that data into there, and then manage that platform independent of the state?
That is a suggestion, not saying
Yep.
we need to, but
Yep.
right now I know that there's limitations with what we have today. And so
Yeah.
how do we provide broader visibility and better alerts?
But I
That's all.
think and I think I understand what you're asking for, and I guess the limitation that would come with that recommendation is that it would take people resources to manage that
It would.
independent piece. So it's not just that software platform that we would be doing an RFP on, we'd actually be investing people then to do that and adding more there. So it's a bigger ongoing recurring cost.
Yes, there would be recurring costs.
Yeah.
And we're not committing to that. My request is there someone that we can have look at the people, the process, and the technologies that we have? And then that might warrant maybe another resource or two. And then as a board, you guys can decide, is $100,000 or $200,000 worth managing your $196 million budget?
So my question is, have you reached out to MSBA and have other districts done this? Is there some kind of a process or someone they recommend?
I
or-
have not.
Well, even before that, I feel like this is an IT-related question, right? It just feels like, what is our IT capabilities? Are they comfortable using? What are they doing with their team that makes?
Well, that's what the RFP would do, would lay out the specs of what requirements are and stuff to see if there's even anything that's available to do that.
And Bill has started reaching out based off of the meeting that we had with other districts as far as what other platforms are there and what their functionality is to that. And so again, you know, he started that process. I think he's going to reach out to the State Department and find out if there is somebody that they recommend through that process as well. So he's kind of already started that. To my knowledge, he hasn't been told that there's anybody who does.
That would be the best
type of
avenue
work.
if we could find something within current resources.
Right, correct.
It'd be great to be a leader, and if it's doable versus not.
Hey, and if we build something, then we can sell it to other school districts. I mean,
Can I make a suggestion?
sure.
Why don't we just take this up at another meeting once we get that information from Bill?
You said you're
'Cause I-
looking
'cause
into it
I-
right now?
Absolutely.
I can't, I'm not making any decision at this point until I find.
Oh, right, I
more
think-
I don't think
he's
that's what he's
asking
asking.
us.
Okay, I thought he was.
Yeah, no, no,
No,
You're saying going out for an RFP.
Nope, that'd be my recommendation.
Oh,
So
okay.
you guys, like,
Can
from
you-
what I see.
Can we,
Like, based on the information that you're trying to gather right now, is there a time period that, like, how much time do you need to gather that information where you could bring something back to the board during a working session and present that information to us?
Oh, honestly, at least a couple months.
Yeah.
Okay.
It's a couple months for that. I mean,
That's
and-
fair.
and-
Yeah.
okay.
And there's
do that.
there's two different lenses. I mean, you can look at it for a group that, or another third-party vendor that looks at, hey, here's how education monitors it. But what I want to know is, like, are there non-education tools that you can bring into it to say, hey, here's best practice in non-education space that you could leverage, that you can use. And so I just want to be mindful that we're not, you know, narrowing on, like, hey, we got to look in this particular space or this industry for
Right.
this kind of tool, because
Yep.
we've got to think outside the box if the tools that are out there aren't delivering what folks might need.
And
Well,
I
let me
think
rephrase
that-
it, what I
yeah.
think we ought to have.
I think that's what Bill is trying to take a look at, but you also have to realize it's probably going to be proprietary. Is that a lot of times the functionality of something is to a specific area, like there's certain things that are probably healthcare related that won't function in education. There's certain things that are in other areas. So I think it's worth the investigation to find out if it's there.
Sure.
Because you mentioned Tableau and stuff like that. It's still got to be able to communicate with the system that we have, and not every system communicates with each system, because they like to get more money out of you by having another
Yeah.
system, so.
So we'll plan on a check-in around April or May. All right, sounds good. All right, next item is,
I have another one. Yep.
Okay.
And so.
I'm trying to move beyond,
No,
sorry.
thank you. So as the treasurer, I think, you know, looking at the budget and knowing what we have, I think there's value of having a school board member on the negotiations committee. And so I think that's something that we should discuss. I think that knowing we've got $196 million in expenses, $5 million as a delta, we've received $22 million. But more importantly, The treasurer's role is to make sure, obviously, we elect a school board administration, I'm sorry, a school administration role to carry out the task and the duties, but it is within the scope of a school district or the school board to appoint a board member on the negotiations committee. I recommend that that's something that we do. I don't know if that's done at this table or at another meeting, but that's my recommendation.
My suggestion is to wait till another work session, because I'm not ready to discuss it at this point, and it's getting late. I would think that we should have that, if you want it, put it on a work session as a topic to discuss.
This is a work session. I guess when I'm looking at it, like, we are in a work session, we can talk about it now. It's part of the treasurer's report that he is asking for based on your looking after finances, correct? I don't know if we have time to sit on this because we have negotiations that are going on right now. And is this something that you're talking about immediately?
I think it makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of conversations that are going on, and obviously a board member on the negotiations committee would be a regular member, and that's part of statutes, that's part of MSBA feedback that I've researched as well. But I think it makes sense to have a board member on the negotiations committee.
The only thing you have to remember is you as a whole board set the parameters already that are
100%.
negotiated. So the person who's sitting there isn't negotiating.
Correct.
You know, so, because you already as a board have set the parameters of what you want administratively for your lead negotiator to negotiate. And so it's a listening opportunity. That's basically what it is, because you as a whole board still have to decide what those parameters are and how those things get hammered out. So there's some districts that have it, most don't. At least to my knowledge, as I've talked to some, so you have the flexibility to do either one, but you have to remember it's a board as a whole that makes those decisions, that already gave the parameters to us in regard to what gets negotiated and how it gets negotiated.
The board members that do have it sitting on it, they're just are listening. They're not actually doing negotiating.
Well, I mean, again, that's part of the strategy of the negotiation committee, where they elect a body or a person, whoever it may be, to be the primary point of contact and the speaker. But yes, I mean, the intent is not to disrupt. The intent is that we ought to have a board member on the negotiations committee.
To listen.
If that's the committee, the negotiation committee's strategy.
The charge of the committee.
Yes.
And are you suggesting that you want to do that as a treasurer?
As a treasurer, yes, I think that yes, I would like to be on it.
Okay.
Tomorrow at 2 o'clock,
Tomorrow at 2 o'clock?
if you as the board decide that's what you want to do.
I would agree that there has to be pretty specific rules around, just because, I think most board members don't know all the details of the contract negotiation. So I know we set parameters, but I feel like we don't have the expertise to, so I would support a board member being part of it as a board observer role. Doesn't mean that that board member doesn't come back to any session with the board that we discuss, like, observe. And I feel like it's not to, once a board member starts talking, I feel like it, unless your level of expertise is that of the executive director, it feels like.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think the intent is for the treasurer to say, hey, we gotta do this, we gotta do that, X, Y, Z. But, you know, when you're part of a committee, that you're an active member of the committee. And so, and you nominate a person to do the things, and again, part of state statutes, part of MSBA feedback that I received, that's acceptable, and that's within the rules of what a committee does. And so, if the agreement within the existing committee is to have a single point of contact doing that communication, that's like the intent is not to disrupt the
process.
The process, but the intent is to make sure that there's a school board member in those negotiation committees or discussions. Now, if things change for whatever reason, you know, those are things, again, you're right, the parameters are already set. The intent is not to change those parameters, but it's to be, and if the current process, that if everyone else is just listening, yes, then that would be the appropriate path.
I'm not ready to make a decision on this, and the reason why is I want to know why some boards have it and some boards don't. There's got to be a reason why each is there.
And the pros and the cons to.
Pardon?
And the pros and the cons
The
to
pros
either
and
way.
cons, I need to know that first. Because I think it's tough for a school board member to be on negotiations when they don't negotiate.
I think it'd be a learning opportunity to kind of hear about the contract and the budget and how that plays out in negotiations if you're in a treasurer role. And especially if he's just listening, like, I guess I don't see any
But I also don't
harm
want
in
to
it.
give our staff members who are at the negotiating table a false sense that we have some other role than what we really do in there. Our role as a board is setting the parameters and having the contract discussions.
And then ultimately, everything has to come back to you for approval. Brenda and I don't get to say,
I don't get to
hey, here's what's happening. You as a board have to do that. We just share and have the conversation about the parameters that you already set, and that's what she negotiates to.
To Terry's point, I think it would be of value to find out who has them on there and the pros and the cons.
Why are they on there?
Yeah, well, why
And what
is
role
it?
do they play?
What are their pros and
And the ones that
cons?
don't have it, why aren't they on there?
Yeah.
So my understanding, as a school board, your primary responsibility is the budget, is managing the policies, and making
They're
sure
not
there's good.
managing negotiations.
Well, I don't think I requested to be managing negotiations. I've asked that a treasurer or a school board member be on the negotiations committee.
Yeah, and I guess I think Terry's just asking that we take it to the next time to have learn something between now and the next meeting or the next time we have this discussion about what districts have board members that sit on negotiations today, and what do they see as pros and cons to that, so we have a little bit of an understanding about,
Yeah, I need to know that.
yeah.
Did you reach out to MSBA and gather any information on this?
So I just gathered, does a school board member have the right to be on a negotiations
And the
committee?
answer is yes.
The answer is yes.
Yep.
Sure.
Do they have the authority or the ability to speak during the communication, during the committee? And the answer is yes, assuming it's aligned to the negotiation committee's strategy or the approach of how they want to go. And so, I understand your point of view, Terry, but
Pardon?
I understand your point of
Yeah.
view. Yep. But that's my recommendation, and I'll throw it out there. If do we vote, do we not vote, or how
We
does
don't
that work?
we don't vote in work
Okay.
sessions, but I guess I would take the recommendation. I know there's a couple of districts that do
I have
have,
a quorum.
No, I'm just saying, if, that's just one of the
So
items
we
that
can-
y'all have talked about before.
I guess I'd like to have another discussion around this after I have time to visit with other school districts, and whether we do it independently or bring it back to the table for another discussion. But I'd like to reach out to board members that have it and understand why.
Does it make sense?
Why or why not?
And it really doesn't, I mean, we're gonna be negotiating every year, so everybody's thinking about the
I
future.
think
It's a
that's the
long-term
role of the
decision.
treasurer.
It's
So you could, if we decide to do it, there's
a
another
long-term
negotiation
decision
coming up
for ongoing. Yep.
I don't
I
see
think
any
we're
harm in it
two
if you're
years.
just listening, but that's just my opinion. I'm one voice.
Do we have to make a long-term decision, or can we make a decision right now?
And the decision you're gonna make, you have to always think is gonna be long-term, what's best for the district, and that will be a long-term. Whether you're doing it for this time or forever, it impacts the district long-term.
Well, I personally
So-
believe that a school board ought to be on those committees in general,
Yeah, and
negotiation committees,
I
whether it
have
be
no problem,
this
but
one
I
or the next one.
want to do my own research before I support it, to make sure I understand everything, because we haven't visited this for several years, and I just like to understand from the districts that do it, what
So-
works and what doesn't work.
Have you had a board member on the negotiations committee in this district before?
No,
One thing to consider, I'm just gonna be frank.
not that I'm,
honest
not
about
what
this,
I've
is
been on
like,
board, let's put it that way.
If we did this, one of the things we've talked about as board is when we can hold meetings because of our various work schedules and things like that. And so, I know I personally would make it relatively earlier because my work ends at whatever time, but some people cannot. And so, if we set this expectation, which I agree, I don't oppose to an observer, but I also worry about setting an absolute that we have to, just because what if we don't have a board member who can attend every negotiation session? And what happens if you can attend some of it and not all of it, or some days and not days, and how does that result in any
That makes sense.
disruption?
Yep.
So I think like part of it is thinking through what would it mean to have, ideally, we would have decided this before any negotiations this year, and I know we talked about it, kind of, but setting the stage for what the expectations of that board member are.
I think that's fair, but I also think that you know, from my understanding, the previous meeting that we had, we didn't have everyone there either. And so there are scenarios where some folks are there and some folks may not be there, but I think as a collective committee, there's still a focus on the objective and the common goal. So there's probably value of making sure everyone's there, but there'll be pockets where folks may or may not be there, so.
Well, there's state statute around that nobody except the district can decide who's on the district team. Somebody else can't decide. There's state statute. I can't coerce somebody to be on EML's group. They can't coerce somebody to be on this group. And I think you also have to take into account it's the teacher group, the custodial group, food service group. So if you're going to be a part of it, I think you have to be a part of all of it, which I've had board members on my negotiation groups before. I don't have an issue with it, but you just have to be mindful of, if you're going to do it, you've got to do it. And it can't be, well, we're just going to do this particular group, because I think it sends a message to the other groups if you don't
That's a good point.
play all the way through.
So I just think it's worth, I mean, I just need to better understand, like Terry, why some are doing it and, you know, what's the pros and the cons, and if, you know, what the charge of that individual is and how they utilize it, and just knowing before I can make a decision, because we do have to establish what that role of that board member is, because they're representing the district then, or representing the board on that committee.
I can be very open to having a board member on that committee, but I need to know the guidelines, the boundaries, the pluses, the
Yep.
minuses before I make a decision.
This wasn't, to be fair, this is no surprises part of our thing, is like none of us will.
That's just here's my treasurer report.
But there's no details,
Yeah.
and so if we had had time to kind of do our research. and
Well, that's what we're just asking to do
Right,
right now.
right.
So I don't think there can be a decision tonight, because they're asking our time to do our due
Everybody needs to
diligence.
feel comfortable.
We can gather the information, whatever you want, and you can have next week, you know, you tell us what information you want, we can turn that information around for you as quick as we can. You do have another meeting scheduled next week. We do have mediation, which mediation is different than negotiations, because mediations, you're normally in two separate rooms.
Yeah.
You're not at the same table normally across from each other, so it's a different environment than the initial negotiations meetings that you have where you're in a room together listening, having some dialogue back and forth. This is a mediator, walks back and forth between the rooms.
So would you be able to reach out to other school districts?
Yep.
That are
Yeah.
having a board member on that committee right
Mhm.
now versus some that aren't, and
Sure.
give us some
And
information?
I would also reach out to your legal counsel and say, what are the pros and cons of it?
Well,
Because
yeah.
you've had a legal person stand in front of you before and say there's pros and cons of it. It depends on how that person, because the person really doesn't represent the board, and you have to be mindful of, they don't represent the board as a whole. It takes 4 board members to make the decision, not one individual. So we can find out other districts, we can speak to legal counsel, get the pros and cons from both their perspectives, so.
And there are 3 areas I think we need to look at is what is the specific role of the board member on that group?
Right.
2, if you don't have one on there, why? What do you see as advantages of having a board member on it? What are the disadvantages of having a board member on it?
Right.
Those are the kind of questions I think, because these people are dealing with those issues now.
Right, I'd also like to know if it's like a rotating member, because to Carly's point, not everybody can take that time
Well,
off of work as
yeah.
you work full-time, so.
I'll just give you my experiences who normally, if you start with a group, you stay at that group. Like, for example, if you're somebody who does a teacher's group, that's the person who does a teacher's group. Then if you have somebody who does custodial group,
Okay.
you kind of rotate through groups rather
But
than.
that one person stays
But
with
that
that
one
one
person
group.
normally
Yeah,
stays
because you
through,
wanna-
has been my experience, rather
Okay.
than a rotating person
Got it.
for each. The group has 4 different people come through it, so.
Makes sense.
You had a different person every week, you'd have to bring them up to, that would not work, no. It's
Well,
just-
no, I was thinking
yeah.
more along his
Right.
lines.
Yeah, well, we can find that out for you.
Okay,
Good.
thank you. Anything else, Brian?
Nope, I don't have any more surprises. So.
Well, it's not really a surprise when we're talking about it at the working session. That's
Yep.
kind of what it's for, so it's okay. So our next item on the agenda is the Public Engagement Committee met, and we were talking through some different events that we wanted to bring to the board as far as our participation. So Carly, I'll let you take over.
Yes, so we have a few different plans that we would want to just get approval from enough board members to attend, and any of the district leadership is welcome as well, obviously. So we talked about meeting with the Indian community in Avonlea on March 5th at 6:30 is the plan.
Are you gonna send these out to us?
Yeah.
Yes.
I am going to check in with Lydia, I think later this week about the resources that we'll be using for, you know, one of the things we talked about in our meeting with the three of us, Terry and Kim and I, is just kind of what would be the purpose of each meeting and what is the plan, and I think depending on the group that we're meeting with, the purpose or plan might be very different. So, for the Indian community, part of it is understanding the history of transition to Lakeville. There was a very large community that transitioned several years ago. Creating a space for listening and answering questions.
To Lakeville or to the schools? You mean
To
to
Lakeville.
schools?
Lakeville area schools, but also to
To Lakeville in general, yeah.
And then we talked about the meeting with the Somali group, but I think in April we were going to do the home expo.
That's in March. Yes.
So maybe in April, I'm going to talk with Lydia about maybe connecting with the Somali liaison to just understand how they would go about that. And then in May, we talked about a Heritage Center event. Terry, you're following up on?
I did. I followed up on that. We have a date. I gave it to you, didn't
May.
I? May.
Sorry.
I gave her the date. I don't know. I'll have to look it up again. Yeah, I think it's May.
Sticking to our Tuesdays?
Not always.
Oh.
Not
Yeah,
always.
so the senior community.
Part of the issues with Heritage Center is they're only open from 8:30 in the morning till 3:30 in the afternoon. So we have to do it.
Oh,
On
okay.
Saturday.
But we aren't doing, no, they aren't open on Saturday.
Oh, sorry.
So we're gonna have to, we're doing it at 9:30. That was their recommended time, 9:30, 10:30. I thought it was the 14th, but I can look at my
Sorry.
text, go ahead, I'll give you the date.
The 11th is a Saturday.
Pardon?
The 11th
The
is a
11th is a Saturday.
And the 4th.
And the 4th is a Saturday.
So maybe that's what we were thinking, and then you found out
What?
they weren't open on the.
They're not open on the Saturdays.
So it can't be either of those dates,
No.
is what we're saying.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well,
So
I'll
you're
get
gonna
it.
follow up. It's a date in May.
I'm gonna give it to you in about 2 minutes. Go ahead.
And then June, we were planning to try to set something up with the city council just to share a strategic plan and updates and just try to have something where we meet with the city council once or twice a year. And then July is kind of part of that, so we want to make sure we're connecting with the community on that's so far.
I already visited with Justin and Tom about that. They're very specific on when they want those things to happen.
Oh.
So we've already visited about it. I did State of the Schools for Oakland Market last week or 2 weeks ago, but it was a virtual. They didn't have you there, but both city councils are open to doing that. They just have very specific times of the year where they want that to take place. So if that's something you want to do, I can rehash that with them again and
Yeah, if you could,
get
that'd
that
be
to
great.
you.
And we can kind of plan around that too. Yeah,
May 14th, 9:30.
so that's a Saturday, right?
It's
No, that's a
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
The Tuesday, the 11th was a Saturday.
It's a Tuesday.
Sorry.
So some of these, we might
Well,
have to
English.
figure out how many board members can attend.
Well, can you just send those to Kim so she
Yes.
can put them on our calendars? Is that all right, Kim?
Yeah.
Thank you.
So one of the things that we were also talking about was being at the Home Expo and kind of having a booth just where we can kind of talk with families as they're walking through. That's at, is it at Lakeville South?
North.
North,
North.
thank you. In March, it's $450 for the school board to have a table there. So that would be the one thing that we would have like some cost associated with.
Can we
It-
piggyback off of Community Ed? They're already there.
They are already there.
Community Ed has a booth.
they do have to.
I could
But I
visit
don't
with
know if we
Steve,
could
but I'm gonna guess
share.
it's a different activity of what they do. If you want it to be, we can ask Steve. I don't know what he'll say, because I think they plan some different activities from the community ed side of things happening out of that booth, but we can ask.
We do have a budget for that, for the board, so, I don't know. It's just something to think about, something we were bringing forward, just because there's a lot of different families at that event. And it's just another way to engage with the community. Yeah,
And I would say not everybody at that event will be Lakeville area schools, families, so you just have,
Which is okay.
you'd have the whole, you'd have a community as a whole
Right.
represented there.
Yeah,
Which
they're,
might be
they come
good.
from all
it'd be
over
good,
for
yeah, I
that.
think it would be
It's a
good.
different group.
Yeah.
So those are just things we talked about.
Right. So we think we need to decide on the home expo thing, because that's like 3 weeks away, so. Therefore,
I guess I would, if, I can check with Steve, see if he's willing to share, but I guess if they're not, I would just
I
need to
just
know if
did,
you want to
yeah.
spend the dollars on it.
Have you guys been to that or done that before? I
I've
don't
been
think
to
we'll
it,
get-
but.
I go to it a lot. People are pretty focused on looking at landscaping and stuff like that. And I'm there for Rotary, and it's, to me, it's not a super huge engagement. And they're from Prior Lake and Savage and all over the place. So it's really not a lot of Lakeville, and if they're there, I don't know. I think there's better ways to be more out there than sitting at a booth and having them come to you, because there's a lot going on in that high school, and they come with a list prepared to check out where their fire pit's gonna be built and all that other stuff, so I think it's a tough thing to do. We do it with Rotary because we're selling Taste of Lakeville tickets there. So people come specifically for the Taste of Lakeville tickets, but
I don't like the expense when we found that out.
Yeah. And then you can go, even if I'm not there for Lakeville Rotary, I would always just go and you just walk and talk and visit with people instead of having a booth. There's nothing wrong with going and walking and talking. I go and talk to the police and fire and all of our businesses that are in town. You can find which ones are the Lakeville businesses that support our schools and visit with them. And so, there's no reason not to go as a school board member, but instead of having a booth, just finding ways to be more active, just being around, going out to them rather than sitting behind a table and having them come to you.
Well, and we do have the other March event, so.
Which is, oh, that's right. I thought we were looking for a March event, so.
We're gonna send that all out there.
Yes.
All right, so I guess we will not be at, I'm hearing that,
I'm just
right, I'm
Yeah.
just hearing consensus that people don't feel like it's worthwhile to be at the home expo and have a booth.
Maybe a couple of us can go.
Okay.
Yeah, just go and just be there where you're.
That's fun just to go see it.
Okay. Sounds good. No worries. We'll Carly would just send those dates to Kim Elson and have her send it out to the board so that we can put it on the calendar and start planning for those. All right, so the last item that we have right now is board goals. This was something that I put on the agenda based on our board self-assessment. And Bree just walked in. Thanks for joining us, Bree.
Right, I had you guys on
Cool.
phone.
So the reason that I put the board goals on there based on our board self-assessment is that I feel like we need to go back to kind of looking at the basics on what we want to do as a board, and then how we're working together to accomplish those goals. Because if we have a goal that we're striving for, then it's going to help us know what our focus is so that we can continue to work with each other and what's best for the students in our district. So I'd kind of like to work through one board goal at a time, and what I really want to look for is those metrics and how we are measuring our progress towards that goal, based on Judy's recommendation on that the other day. So considering that we have a couple committees going right now, policy and public engagement, I thought we'd just start with goal one, which was to increase board member public engagement throughout our community, to foster a stronger sense of connection and involvement among our district stakeholders. So that's kind of what we're working on. What we need to figure out is what are our action steps, well, what are our metrics to measure that we've achieved that goal? Where do we want to be at the end of the year? Say like in July, when we take that board self-assessment again and we're thinking about this goal, how do we know we met that goal? How do we know that we accomplished that? I do feel like the policy committee's or the committees that we've started are good things. That's kind of some ways that we are living out that goal in our work. But I think we need to be a little bit more specific on that, also including in that how we work together, which is why we took that board self-assessment. That was kind of our temperature to see where we're at. We intend to take that again in July and to kind of focus into next year too on what we want to work on as a board. But that's kind of the conversation that I at least wanted to start tonight. We don't have to come with any action steps tonight. Obviously, it was just me presenting that. And then hoping we can kind of build some of those action steps in. Do you have any thoughts about any of this stuff? I mean, it's kind of me talking.
It's kind of hard when you have a goal like that, because you don't know what your baseline is. And how are you going
Well,
to judge?
we have a baseline. I mean, we took our board self-assessment as
No,
far
I
as
meant
like.
regarding public involvement.
I think that was part of the discussion we had the last time, was
Right.
that this is establishing the baselines, because we don't have anything.
Right.
That's what I'm saying,
So,
suggesting. Maybe we
the-
should just see where we're at with the number of activities that we get involved in. And, I don't know, measure it again next year to see if we grow. I'm not sure how we get metrics on that. How would we do that?
Well, I mean, we have to start getting some of these on the calendar and finding out,
Yeah.
how many things we participated in versus last year we really didn't. So this is
Right.
really establishing the baseline, making sure we're doing something. And then next year we want to, but I think the bigger question is, how do we determine whether or not these engagements are doing what we want them to do,
Right.
which is getting more connected to the community and to our staff and being out there and available. So.
That would be a self-assessment, then we would judge.
Well, it's
whether
not,
we-
but it's not the self-assessment. We have to ask our community and our staff if they feel that all what we have done, do they feel more connected? Do they feel we know more about what's happening? And I think it's important to figure out avenues. I get getting out into the community, but the engagement has to also be into our buildings. And so, just making sure that you're going into the buildings, not just for a concert, but what are you doing to see what's happening and know what's going on, and visiting with the teachers and the students and the parents and stuff like that. So there's a lot of school activities that are going on all the time that I think we need to find out, making sure we have some board members represented at some of those to just talk to the parents and talk to the students and
Well,
talk
and
to the kids.
I think we talked about that last time. We're not always aware of what's going on in the buildings, so that doesn't help us be involved in that either. Because we talked about getting like from the principals, like the updates.
Well-
Kim put stuff on the calendar in the WAU, is that
Yeah.
correct? Yeah. And I think I think you can do other things, not only go in there, but I think there's a benefit, even though you haven't done it since I've been here. I think there's a benefit. We do our staff members of the month. Either come when we're handing out those awards, or we bring them into a board meeting. I think we have students of the month. You either come when we're doing those awards, or have them come into board meetings, or recognize some of the students that have won awards. Even though we do the good news, sometimes it would be nice to bring those folks in and let them, you see them as the people and acknowledge. So I think it's both. I think it's a balance of going to them and bringing some folks to you and acknowledging what they're doing as well.
But I think it's also, there's a lot of stuff going in our buildings, and I spend a lot of time, like I did the STEM night, they had the STEM exposition over at Lakeville South. I went to STEM night, and so I walked around and talked to the kids and the teachers all about the STEM programs. And then while I was there, one of the young ladies, who's a senior, was telling me how they were doing that the Herstory STEM night. They did that STEM thing, so they invited me to go to that during the day, where they were talking about learning about females, learning about STEM programs in the different industries, and they had some businesses there, so that I went to that. So, I mean, I think maybe that's a role that the engagement committee can do, is find out what's going on in our high schools, you know, reaching out and touching base with them, because there's so much going on. It would be impossible, because we get pinged 1,000 times a day for what's going on in all the different classrooms and all the different schools. But I think, like, I got invited to the STEM thing because I go to it every year, so they go, just so you know, it's coming up, and I think we all got an invite for that from the
We did,
teachers
yeah.
there. But, and then you go to that, and you visit, and you learn about the next thing, and so, I don't know, maybe there's something that the engagement team can figure out, how to get connected in our schools. I think it's important to be connected out to the community, but we're missing the boat on connecting into the schools.
Maybe a good place to start in the elementary level would be with the PTOs, just to see like what events they have and
Yeah,
where they
there
need
you go.
volunteers. Right, I don't know if
But
that's.
doesn't each building have a calendar?
Well, they do, and it's probably on the website, and you can probably take a look at that, but
That's something we could do. We could look at that and
But maybe that's
give them a
something.
monthly list of things.
Sorry, Brian.
It's all right, when you're ready.
Go ahead.
Oh, it's good discussion. I mean, again, some of the things that I think about when we do these kind of things, and I think we came up with these two objectives or ideas last year, before we did the self-assessment.
In August.
In August, before we did the self-assessment. So whenever you do these initiatives or these projects, we should probably ask ourselves, like, what problem are we trying to solve? Is there a problem? I mean, does the community not feel that we're out there enough? And, but if we're doing these things, which is fine, but like, do they want us to do these things? So if we're, since we took the self-assessment, it might make more sense to look at that self-assessment and realign on, like, what are the top two, three things where we've got big gaps in. Maybe that's what we focus on. I'm not saying we need to change the two that we've already elected, the engagement, and I think the other one was.
We have 3 goals.
Okay,
So,
we have 3 goals.
Yep, the first one was really focusing on public engagement.
Yep.
The second one was enhance the Board of Education leadership to cultivate a more dynamic and skilled team to better support our systems to meet the needs of our district and the needs of our students. Goal 3 was to strengthen the operational oversight to ensure efficient and effective management of resources and process, leading to improved district performance and cost effectiveness. And when I think about that goal, I think about
Very lengthy, yes.
right, like
Yeah.
the policy committee
Yeah.
and things that we started to kind of work on some of those things. So it's not like we're not taking steps to do it. I'm
Yep.
just trying to figure out ways to measure progress and success.
But we should probably get more tactical, and I think my recommendation is if we're gonna use the self-assessment as a baseline or as a tool to see if we've made improvements, then let's go back to the self-assessment and say, what areas do we want to focus on as a group? And then use those 3 or 2 and then reassess. But again, the ones that we've suggested or we wrote down were more client-facing or community-facing objectives. And the self-assessment is more internal forces. So
Correct.
what's, like, I don't know.
that was only used to
Maybe.
identify one of our goals.
Yeah.
The
Right.
operational one, you know, about how, whatever the third one was. But then we had the community survey, and then we were also just hearing, you know, and we heard it tonight with stakeholder sessions, please come and be in my classroom and stuff. So I think it's important. So the goals have come from different places because there is a need that needs to happen. The bigger issue is how do we know that it's accomplishing what we're supposed to be solving?
But you gotta grab a data metric before and after.
Correct.
That's it.
And that's what but because we're all just starting with this, we can create a metric of trying to get engaged out in the community, out into the schools, knowing we've done it, but how do we know it's making a difference?
Yeah.
And so that's, I think.
Don't we do community surveys? I mean, isn't there a question in there like, hey, do you like the board?
There is, but
there is.
that's the point we have to figure out is how often do we do those community surveys? Because sometimes we do them, you know, twice, once every 2 years, once every year, depending on what the survey's around. And we have to make sure that we're asking the same question then to see if there's changes in it. So the bigger struggle is really just knowing what we're doing and if it's effective. And if it's not, what do we need to do to make it effective?
Right.
Or are you asking like, how do we measure that?
I was just wanting to focus on goal 1 and try to figure out where we go from here on that. So
That's
what?
the engagement one.
Right, so what I'll do is, I'll follow up with Kim and I'll see what we're doing to track attendance on some of those events. I'll kind of and I want other board members too to think about, like, when you're attending things, like, how are we tracking that? Like, maybe if you could just send an email so we know, who's attending what.
Can you repeat the first goal for me again?
Increase board member public engagement throughout our school community to foster a stronger sense of connection and involvement among our district stakeholders.
So there's two things in there. Are we trying to increase engagement so that people know that we're there, or are we trying to measure, foster, that community members feel that we're fostering? What was the second part of that question?
Stronger sense of connection and involvement among our district stakeholders.
So that came from the fact, and we had this discussion back in July or August,
Yeah.
was that we didn't feel, the board didn't feel that our stakeholders were connected enough to be a part of what we were doing in the district, to take interest in what we were doing.
Okay, so that's our personal opinion, but do we have data that said that we were not fostering community engagement?
I don't think there's I don't think
We're
there's a
just starting,
direct
so.
survey.
Well, then,
I think,
makes
well,
sense to
no,
start
I
with.
think there was though, that came from, I just
Yeah.
need to go back, there's a lot in this head in the last 6 months, a year.
Right.
But I think it came from the fact that we had very low engagement numbers with people that
The
came.
stakeholder session, right? We
Well,
just weren't having a lot of people
our
attend
stakeholder
those.
sessions and into, it wasn't around public comment, it was around our stakeholder session and other things that we were doing at the time as we were moving into the levy referendums and all that kind of stuff, that we wanted to make sure that we had more active engagement from our stakeholders. And we did have numbers that showed very low attendance for what the board felt we should have.
Well, and I think also we were looking at that survey and who answered the surveys. And then figuring out, like, not everybody is comfortable coming to a stakeholder session or public comment. So how are we engaging those people within our community that maybe don't have the means or the access, or maybe they're working or whatever? How are we engaging those different groups of people?
It was a handful of things that we felt the numbers should be higher on the turnout. Now, you look at the boundary adjustments and, to have 3,500 different pieces of input and feedback was probably one of the best.
Go ahead.
No, so it's a new year. We've been in this role now for almost 12, 13 months. Maybe it makes sense to revisit those 3 goals and say, hey, are these still accurate? So, my thoughts.
Okay. In the meantime, like I said, I'll do some work around how we're gathering that data for public engagement, and seeing if there's a way I can.
Committee can work on that too.
Yeah, maybe the public engagement committee can look at that and see if there's a way to
We
manage
got a
that data.
meeting coming
so-
up in a couple of weeks.
Yep, so then we'll just take a look at that then. All right, so that was the last thing that we had on the agenda. So the board will move into closed session pursuant to Minnesota State Statute, Section 13D.05, Subdivision 3B, to engage in negotiations discussion.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.